Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Meet Tiye, the woman who redefined what it meant to be powerful in the ancient world. While history books often focus on the famous pharaohs like Tutankhamun or Ramesses the Great, they rarely tell you about the woman who pulled the strings behind the scenes for over 4 decades. This wasn't just any queen consort sitting quietly in the palace. This was a political mastermind who commanded armies, negotiated with foreign kings, and shaped the destiny of Egypt during its most prosperous era. But here's what makes Tiye's story absolutely incredible. She didn't just influence one pharaoh. She guided 3 generations of Egyptian rulers, maintained Egypt's dominance over the ancient world, and did it all while operating from the shadows. Most people have never even heard her name, yet she arguably wielded more real power than any pharaoh of her time. In this video, I'm going to reveal the extraordinary story of how Tiye rose from provincial nobility to become the most influential woman in Egyptian history. You'll discover the cunning political strategies she used to maintain power across multiple reigns, the international crisis she single-handedly resolved, and why her own son tried to erase her from history. But first, let me show you just how revolutionary Tiye's influence really was by examining evidence that will completely change how you think about ancient Egyptian power structures. Picture this. It's 1353 BCE, and messengers are racing across the ancient world, carrying urgent diplomatic correspondence. But here's the shocking part. These letters aren't addressed to the Pharaoh of Egypt. They're addressed to Queen Tiye. Kings from Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni are writing directly to her, seeking trade her counsel on matters of war and international politics. This wasn't protocol. This was unprecedented. Foreign rulers recognized that the real power in Egypt flowed through this remarkable woman. Now, you might be thinking this sounds impossible. How could a queen mother command such respect in a male-dominated ancient world? The answer lies in understanding just how extraordinary Tiye's political acumen really was, and it all started with a love story that changed the course of Egyptian history. The year was 1390 BCE, and Egypt was at the height of its imperial power. The Nile Valley stretched from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north, creating the wealthiest empire the world had ever seen. Gold flowed from Nubian mines, tribute poured in from conquered territories, and Egyptian influence extended across the known world. But maintaining this vast empire required more than military might. It demanded sophisticated diplomacy, strategic alliances, and political intelligence that could navigate the complex web of ancient Near Eastern politics. Into this world stepped a young woman named Tiye, daughter of Yuya and Chuyu, provincial nobles from the town of Akhmim in Upper Egypt. Now Tiye wasn't born into the royal bloodline. She wasn't a princess from a foreign kingdom brought in to cement a political alliance. She was what we might call middle nobility, certainly wealthy and well-connected, but not destined for the throne by birthright. Yet somehow, this provincial girl would capture the attention of the most powerful man in the world. Prince Amenhotep, heir to the Egyptian throne, was everything you'd expect from a future pharaoh. Tall, athletic, educated in warfare and diplomacy, and destined to inherit an empire that spanned continents. Royal marriages in ancient Egypt were typically arranged affairs, designed to strengthen political bonds or maintain the purity of royal bloodlines. Pharaohs often married their sisters or half-sisters to keep power concentrated within the royal family. But when Amenhotep met Tiye, something unprecedented happened. He fell in love. He fell in. Now, this wasn't just a romantic fairy tale. Amenhotep's decision to marry Tiye represented a calculated political risk that would reshape Egyptian royal protocol forever. By choosing a wife from outside the immediate royal family, he was signaling that merit and intelligence could triumph over bloodline politics. But more importantly, he was recognizing qualities in Tiye that would prove invaluable to Egypt's future prosperity. The wedding of Amenhotep and Tiye in 1390 BCE was a spectacle that announced Egypt's confidence to the world. Massive celebrations stretched along the Nile, tribute flowed in from vassal states, and diplomatic gifts arrived from kingdoms across the ancient Near East. But the most significant aspect of this union wasn't the ceremony itself. It was the commemorative scarabs that Amenhotep issued to announce his marriage. These scarabs were essentially ancient press releases distributed throughout the Egyptian empire to announce major royal events. What made Tiye's marriage scarabs revolutionary was their content. Instead of simply mentioning the new queen's name, they provided her full genealogy, naming her parents Yuya and Juyu and establishing her legitimacy as queen consort. This level of detail was unprecedented for a non-royal wife, and signalled that Tiye would play a role far beyond traditional queenly duties. The early years of their marriage revealed just how prescient Amenhotep's choice had been. As the young couple settled into palace life in Memphis and Thebes, Tiye began demonstrating the political intelligence that would define her reign. She didn't simply host banquets and perform ceremonial functions. She immersed herself in the complex machinery of Egyptian administration, learning the intricate details of tax collection, military organization, and diplomatic protocol. But Tiye's real genius lay in understanding something that many rulers miss. True power doesn't always come from making the loudest proclamations or issuing the most dramatic decrees. Sometimes, the most effective influence flows through quiet conversations, strategic alliances, and the ability to be indispensable to those who hold official authority. While Amenhotep focused on grand building projects and military campaigns, Tiye was building something far more valuable. She was constructing a network of loyal administrators, priests, and military officers who recognized her wisdom and sought her counsel. The first major test of Tiye's political skills came just 5 years into their marriage, when a crisis new erupted in Baya. Egyptian gold mines, the economic foundation of the empire's wealth, came under attack from local tribal confederations who had grown tired of Egyptian exploitation. Traditional pharaonic response would have involved massive military expeditions, costly in both lives and resources. But Tiye proposed a different approach. Working behind the scenes, she orchestrated a diplomatic solution that combined targeted military pressure with economic incentives and strategic marriages between Egyptian officials and local Nubian leaders. The result was a peaceful resolution that actually increased Egypt's gold production while reducing military expenditures. Foreign ambassadors took note. Here was a queen who could solve complex international problems through intelligence rather than brute force. Word of Tiye's diplomatic success spread throughout the ancient Near East, reaching the courts of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the emerging Hittite kingdom. In an age when royal women were typically confined to ceremonial roles, Tiye was emerging as a genuine political player whose opinions carried weight in international affairs. Kings began sending gifts directly to her, recognizing that her influence with Amenhotep could be crucial in securing favorable treatment for their kingdoms. By 1385 BCE, just 5 years after her marriage, Tiye had transformed from a provincial noble's daughter into one of the most politically connected individuals in the ancient world. She maintained correspondence with foreign rulers, advised on military strategy, and had begun placing her trusted allies in key administrative positions throughout the Egyptian bureaucracy. But her greatest challenge was yet to come. The birth of her first son, Prince Thutmose, in 1384 BCE should have been a moment of pure celebration. An heir to the throne had been secured, ensuring dynastic continuity for generations to come. But Tiye recognized that in the dangerous world of ancient Egyptian politics, Royal children were both blessings and vulnerabilities. Palace coups, succession disputes, and assassination attempts were constant threats that could destroy everything she and Amenhotep had built. So Tiye began implementing what we might recognize today as a comprehensive security and education strategy for the royal family. She personally oversaw Prince Thutmose's education, ensuring he learned not just traditional royal subjects like warfare and religious protocol, but also the subtle arts of diplomacy and political strategy that had served her so well. More importantly, she began cultivating relationships with key military commanders and provincial governors who would be crucial in protecting her family's interests during any future succession crisis. But fate had different plans for the Egyptian royal family. Prince Thutmose died unexpectedly in 1377 BCE, leaving the succession in question and creating exactly the kind of dynastic uncertainty that Tiye had worked so hard to prevent. The loss of their firstborn son devastated both Tiye and Amenhotep, but it also presented the queen with perhaps the greatest political challenge of her career. With Prince Thutmose gone, attention turned to their second son, a young prince who would eventually become one of the most controversial figures in Egyptian history. But in 1377 BCE, he was simply a backup heir who had never expected to rule. His name was Amenhotep, later known to history as Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who would attempt to revolutionize Egyptian religion and nearly destroy the empire his parents had worked so hard to build. Tiye understood immediately that her younger son's unexpected elevation to heir apparent would require a completely different approach than the careful grooming she had provided for Thutmose. This boy was brilliant, philosophical, and deeply introspective, but he lacked the practical political instincts that had made his older brother such a promising future ruler. Where Thutmose had been naturally diplomatic and pragmatic, young Amenhotep was idealistic and prone to grand gestures that could destabilize the very foundations of Egyptian power. The Queen Mother recognized that she was facing a critical decision point. She could either try to reshape her surviving son into a conventional pharaoh, forcing him to suppress his natural inclinations in favor of traditional royal behavior, or she could find a way to channel his unique qualities into effective leadership while protecting Egypt from his more dangerous impulses. Characteristically, Tiye chose the more complex path. Over the next 7 years, as her husband Amenhotep III continued his reign and their son prepared for eventual succession, Tiye embarked on what might be the most sophisticated political balancing act in ancient history. She began building dual power structures within the Egyptian government. On the surface, traditional administrative hierarchies continued to function exactly as they always had. Provincial governors reported to the vizier, military commanders answered to established chains of command, and religious authorities maintained their ceremonial roles. But beneath this conventional framework, Tiye was quietly constructing an alternative network of influence that would allow her to maintain effective of what control, regardless decisions her son might make as pharaoh. She placed trusted allies in key positions throughout the bureaucracy, cultivated personal relationships with influential priests and military leaders, and established direct communication channels with foreign courts that bypassed normal diplomatic protocols. The genius of Tiye's strategy became apparent when Amenhotep III died in 1353 BCE, and their son ascended to the throne as Amenhotep IV. The new pharaoh immediately began displaying the religious obsessions that would eventually lead him to abandon traditional Egyptian polytheism in favor of worshipping a single solar deity called the Aten. Most royal advisors were horrified by these theological innovations, recognizing that they threatened the entire social and political structure of Egyptian civilization. But Tiye had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Rather than opposing her son's religious reforms directly, which would have created an open confrontation between mother and son that could have torn the kingdom apart, she chose a more subtle approach. She allowed Amenhotep to pursue his theological experiments while quietly maintaining parallel relationships with traditional religious authorities who remained loyal to the old gods. This delicate balancing act required incredible diplomatic skill. When her son decided to change his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten and move the capital from Thebes to a newly constructed city called Amarna, Tiye publicly supported these decisions while privately reassuring nervous administrators that essential government functions would continue uninterrupted. When foreign ambassadors expressed confusion about Egypt's new religious direction, Tiye met with them personally to explain that Egypt's international commitments remained unchanged despite domestic theological innovations. The Amarna Letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered by archaeologists in the late 19th century, provide remarkable insight into just how effectively Tiye managed this impossible situation. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform script, reveal that foreign rulers were indeed writing directly to Tiye rather than to her son the pharaoh when they needed reliable information about Egyptian policy. One particularly revealing letter comes from Tushratta, king of Mitanni, who had maintained friendly relations with Egypt for decades. Writing to Tiye around 1350 BCE, Tushratta expresses concern about changes in Egyptian diplomatic behavior and asks the Queen Mother to personally ensure that traditional alliance agreements would be honored. The tone of this correspondence makes clear that Tushratta viewed Tiye, not Akhenaten, as the ultimate decision-maker in Egyptian foreign policy. But managing international relations was only one aspect of Tiye's complex responsibilities during her son's increasingly erratic reign. As Akhenaten became more obsessed with his religious reforms, essential administrative functions began to suffer. Tax collection became irregular, military preparedness declined, and provincial governors found themselves receiving contradictory instructions from different sources within the royal bureaucracy. Recognizing that Egypt's prosperity depended on maintaining efficient government operations regardless of pharaonic theological preoccupations, Tiye began operating what amounted to a shadow administration. Working through her network of loyal officials, she ensured that crucial functions like grain distribution, military supply chains, and diplomatic communications continued operating smoothly, even when official royal attention was focused elsewhere. This parallel government structure required extraordinary organizational skills and absolute discretion. Tiye had to coordinate complex operations across vast geographical distances while maintaining the fiction that her son remained in complete control of Egyptian affairs. She accomplished this through a combination of personal charisma, strategic gift-giving, and careful cultivation of key relationships that had been decades in the making. The most challenging aspect of Tiye's shadow rule involved managing Egypt's military obligations. The empire's vast territorial holdings required constant attention from experienced commanders who understood both local conditions and broader strategic considerations. But Akhenaten showed little interest in military affairs, preferring to focus on artistic and religious projects that reflected his personal theological vision. Rather than allowing Egypt's military capabilities to deteriorate, Tiye took direct control of strategic planning and resource allocation. She met regularly with senior commanders, reviewed intelligence reports from border regions, and authorized military expeditions when necessary to maintain imperial stability. Foreign enemies who might have expected to exploit Egypt's apparent governmental chaos discovered that Egyptian military responses remained as swift and effective as ever. One particularly dramatic example of Tiye's military leadership occurred in 1348 BCE when Hittite forces launched a surprise attack on Egyptian positions in northern Syria. Traditional protocol would have required extensive consultations between pharaoh, military commanders, and religious advisors before authorizing any response. But Tiye recognized that rapid action was essential to prevent a broader collapse of Egyptian authority in the Levant. Working through her network of loyal commanders, she authorized an immediate counterattack that caught the Hittites completely off guard. Egyptian forces not only repelled the invasion but pursued the retreating enemy deep into Hittite territory, capturing significant amounts of equipment and prisoners. The speed and effectiveness of this response sent a clear message to potential enemies throughout the region that Egypt remained a formidable military power despite apparent internal distractions. But Tiye's most delicate challenge involved managing the succession question that would ultimately determine Egypt's future stability. By 1345 BCE, it had become clear that Akhenaten's religious reforms were causing serious internal tensions that threatened dynastic continuity. Traditional priests were openly hostile to the new theological direction. Provincial administrators were struggling to implement contradictory policies, and foreign allies were expressing increasing concern about Egypt's reliability as a partner. Recognizing that her son's reign was becoming unsustainable, Tiye began carefully positioning alternative candidates who could potentially restore stability to Egyptian government. This involved incredibly sensitive political maneuvering, because any appearance of disloyalty to the re-trigger reigning pharaoh could have a succession crisis that might have destroyed the entire royal family. The Queen Mother's solution was characteristically sophisticated. Rather than openly opposing Akhenaten, she began promoting the careers of younger royal family members who showed more conventional leadership qualities. She arranged strategic marriages, provided advanced education opportunities, and gradually introduced these potential successors to key administrative and military personnel who would be crucial in any future transition. Chief among these candidates was her grandson, a young prince who had been born around 1341 BCE and showed remarkable promise despite his youth. This boy, originally named Tutankhaten, but later known to history as Tutankhamun, represented everything that Tiye hoped could restore Egypt's traditional greatness. He was intelligent but practical, religiously conservative but politically flexible, and most importantly, he possessed the kind of personal charisma that could unite Egyptian society after years of divisive theological conflict. But grooming Tutankhamun for eventual succession represented only part of Tiye's long-term strategy. She understood that restoring Egypt's stability would require more than simply replacing one pharaoh with another. The entire governmental structure that Akhenaten had disrupted would need careful reconstruction, and that process would demand the kind of institutional knowledge that only she possessed after decades of behind-the-scenes leadership. So while publicly maintaining her role as supportive Queen Mother, Tiye began implementing what amounted to a comprehensive restoration plan. She started by quietly reassuring traditional religious authorities that Egypt's ancient theological traditions would eventually be restored. High priests who had watched in horror as Akhenaten dismantled centuries-old religious practices received discreet messages that their patience would be rewarded and their positions secured under future leadership. Simultaneously, she worked to repair the administrative chaos that years of contradictory royal decrees had created throughout the empire. Provincial governors who had struggled to implement Akhenaten's revolutionary policies found themselves receiving unofficial guidance from royal messengers who spoke with unmistakable authority. Tax collection procedures that had become hopelessly confused were quietly standardized through informal networks that bypassed official channels entirely. The international dimension of Tiye's restoration efforts proved equally complex. Foreign rulers who had grown accustomed to dealing directly with her rather than with Akhenaten needed reassurance that Egypt's commitments would remain stable regardless of future dynastic changes. This required incredibly delicate diplomacy, because any suggestion that the current pharaoh's authority was temporary could have triggered immediate challenges to Egyptian power throughout the empire. Tiye's solution was to frame these conversations in terms of eternal Egyptian principles rather than temporary political arrangements. When with foreign ambassadors, she emphasized meeting Egypt's unchanging commitment to prosperity, stability, and mutual allied kingdoms. She benefited with any direct son's policies, avoid criticism of her, while making clear that Egypt's fundamental strategic interests remained exactly what they had always been. One particularly revealing episode occurred in 1344 BCE, when a delegation from the Kingdom of Babylon arrived at Amarna seeking clarification about Egypt's position on several disputed territorial claims. Akhenaten, absorbed in supervising the construction of new temples dedicated to the Aten, showed little interest in these complex negotiations. The Babylonian ambassadors found themselves essentially ignored by the pharaoh they had traveled hundreds of miles to meet. Rather than allowing this diplomatic crisis to escalate, Tiye intervened personally. She invited the Babylonian delegation to a private audience, where she demonstrated complete mastery of the territorial disputes in question. Not only did she possess detailed knowledge of historical precedents and legal arguments, she also understood the economic and strategic implications of various potential settlements. By the end of their meeting, the Babylonians had agreed to a comprehensive treaty that protected Egyptian interests while providing them with face-saving concessions on minor points. What made this diplomatic triumph particularly significant was that the entire negotiation occurred without any official involvement from Akhenaten. The Babylonian ambassadors returned home with a treaty that bore the pharaoh's seal, but everyone involved understood that the real architect of the agreement had been Queen Mother Tiye. Word of this successful negotiation spread throughout diplomatic circles, reinforcing the perception that she remained Egypt's most reliable decision-maker, despite official protocols suggesting otherwise. But managing foreign relations represented only the most visible aspect of Tiye's shadow administration. Behind the scenes, she was orchestrating an even more ambitious project aimed at preserving Egypt's accumulated governmental expertise for future generations. Recognizing that Akhenaten's reign had disrupted normal succession planning and administrative training, she began creating what amounted to an alternative educational system for potential future leaders. Young princes, promising administrators, and talented military officers found themselves invited to informal gatherings where Tiye shared decades of accumulated wisdom about effective governance. These weren't official royal councils or formal training programs that might have attracted unwanted attention from Akhenaten's supporters. Instead, they appeared to be simple social occasions where Egypt's most experienced leader happened to offer guidance to younger colleagues seeking career advancement. The curriculum of these informal education sessions covered everything from practical administrative techniques to sophisticated diplomatic strategies. Tiye taught her protégés how to read the subtle signals that indicated provincial unrest before it erupted into open rebellion. She explained the complex web of relationships between different religious authorities and how those relationships could be managed to maintain social stability. Most importantly, she shared the hard-won insights about international politics that had made her such an effective negotiator with foreign powers. One of Tiye's most promising students was a young military commander named Horemheb, who had distinguished himself in several border campaigns, despite the general decline in Egyptian military preparedness during Akhenaten's reign. Horemheb possessed exactly the kind of practical leadership skills that Tiye recognized would be essential for Egypt's eventual recovery, but he lacked the political sophistication necessary to navigate the complex challenges of royal court intrigue. Under Tiye's mentorship, Horemheb learned to balance military efficiency with diplomatic finesse. She taught him how to maintain loyalty among his troops, while also cultivating relationships with civilian administrators who would be crucial for logistical support. More importantly, she helped him understand the delicate art of offering advice to royal superiors without appearing to challenge their authority directly. The relationship between Tiye and Horemheb illustrates perfectly how the Queen Mother was preparing for multiple possible succession scenarios. If young Tutankhamun proved capable of effective leadership, Horemheb could serve as a loyal military commander who would help restore Egypt's international prestige. But if circumstances required a different solution, Horemheb possessed the combination of military credibility and political training that could make him a viable candidate for pharaonic authority himself. Similar relationships were developing between Tiye and other key figures throughout the Egyptian power structure. The high priest Ai, who happened to be Tiye's brother and therefore Tutankhamun's great-uncle, received careful guidance about managing the complex process of religious restoration that would be necessary to heal the theological divisions created by Akhenaten's reforms. Senior administrators how learned to maintain governmental continuity during periods of political transition. provincial governors discovered techniques for balancing local autonomy with imperial unity. What emerges from studying this period is a picture of Tiye as perhaps the most sophisticated political strategist in ancient history. While her son pursued his revolutionary religious vision with single-minded intensity, she was quietly constructing the framework that would allow Egyptian civilization to survive and eventually thrive again. She understood that lasting political change requires more than dramatic gestures or inspiring rhetoric. It demands patient institution building, careful relationship management, and the ability to think several moves ahead of immediate challenges. The effectiveness of Tiye's long-term planning became apparent in 1336 BCE, when Akhenaten died suddenly after 17 years of increasingly erratic rule. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious, with some historians suggesting natural causes, while others point to evidence of possible assassination. But regardless of how Akhenaten's reign ended, the succession crisis that everyone had feared for years finally arrived. In most ancient kingdoms, the sudden death of a controversial ruler would have triggered immediate civil war as different factions fought to place their preferred candidates on the throne. Provincial governors might have declared independence, foreign enemies would have seized the opportunity to attack weakened border regions, and religious authorities would have demanded immediate reversal of unpopular policies regardless of political consequences. But none of these predictable disasters occurred in Egypt, and the reason was simple. Tiye had spent nearly 2 decades preparing for exactly this scenario. When Akhenaten died, the governmental machinery that she had constructed behind the scenes immediately activated to ensure smooth succession and rapid stabilization of Egyptian authority throughout the empire. The transition began with the elevation of Tutankhamun to pharaonic authority, but everyone involved understood that the real power would continue to flow through Queen Mother Tiye until the young pharaoh gained sufficient experience to rule independently. This arrangement satisfied multiple constituencies that might otherwise have challenged the succession. Traditional religious authorities were reassured by Tiye's known commitment to restoring ancient practices. Military commanders respected her proven ability to coordinate effective strategic responses. Provincial administrators trusted her deep understanding of complex governmental operations. Most importantly, foreign rulers who had maintained relationships with Tiye for decades saw no reason to test Egypt's strength during what appeared to be a seamless leadership transition. Rather than viewing Tutankhamun's youth as an opportunity for territorial expansion or diplomatic pressure, neighboring kingdoms continued their established patterns of cooperation and tribute payment, because they understood that Egypt's real decision-making authority remained unchanged. The first major test of this new governmental arrangement came just months after Tutankhamun's coronation, when reports arrived of a serious rebellion in Nubia. Local chieftains had apparently concluded that Egypt's succession crisis provided an opportunity to throw off imperial control and reclaim independence for their territories. Traditional pharaonic response would have involved massive military expeditions designed to demonstrate royal power through overwhelming force. But Tiye recognized that this situation required a more nuanced approach that would establish Tutankhamun's credibility while avoiding the enormous expense of prolonged military campaigns. Working through her network of experienced commanders, she orchestrated a carefully calibrated response that combined targeted military strikes with sophisticated diplomatic negotiations aimed at isolating the rebellion's leadership from potential supporters. The strategy proved brilliantly effective. Egyptian forces quickly captured the rebellion's main strongholds, while diplomatic agents convinced most Nubian chieftains that their interests lay in continued cooperation with Egypt rather than uncertain independence. Within 6 months, Nubian gold production had returned to normal levels, and tribute payments were flowing north to Egyptian treasuries, exactly as they had before the crisis began. Foreign observers took careful note of how efficiently Egypt had handled this potential disaster. Rather than seeing weakness in the young pharaoh's reign, they witnessed a demonstration of institutional strength that suggested Egyptian power remained as formidable as ever. Diplomatic correspondence from this period shows foreign rulers expressing renewed respect for Egyptian capabilities and renewed interest in maintaining positive relationships with the empire. But while managing external challenges occupied much of Tiye's attention, she also faced the enormous task of healing the internal divisions that Akhenaten's religious reforms had created within Egyptian society. Traditional priests remained bitter about years of persecution and temple closures. Administrative officials struggled with contradictory legal precedents that had accumulated during the Amarna period. Common people were confused about which gods they were supposed to worship and which religious practices were currently acceptable. Tiye's approach to religious restoration demonstrated the same sophisticated political instincts that had served her so well in other areas. Rather than simply ordering immediate reversal of all Akhenaten's innovations, which might have created new conflicts, she orchestrated a gradual transition that allowed different groups to save face while moving toward renewed stability. The process began with subtle changes in official royal imagery and terminology. References to the Aten became less prominent in royal inscriptions, while traditional Egyptian deities gradually reappeared in ceremonial contexts. Temple complexes that had been abandoned during Akhenaten's reign were quietly reopened and rededicated to their original purposes. Most importantly, traditional priestly hierarchies were restored with careful attention to maintaining the dignity of religious authorities who had suffered during the previous reign. This careful orchestration of religious restoration required incredible diplomatic skill because it involved balancing competing demands from multiple, maintaining the appearance constituencies while of royal decisiveness. Tiye had to reassure traditional priests that their authority would be fully restored without alienating officials who had supported Akhenaten's reforms. She needed to demonstrate respect for ancient religious traditions while avoiding any appearance of criticizing the previous pharaoh's policies directly. The success of this religious restoration became apparent in the remarkable artistic and architectural achievements that characterized the early years of Tutankhamun's reign. Temples that had stood empty for decades were filled once again with elaborate ceremonies celebrating traditional Egyptian deities. Skilled craftsmen who had been unemployed during the Amarna period found themselves overwhelmed with commissions for religious artwork that reflected renewed commitment to ancient artistic standards. But perhaps the most significant indicator of Tiye's successful management of this complex transition was the international reaction to Egypt's religious changes. Rather than viewing the restoration of traditional practices as a sign of internal weakness or political instability, foreign rulers interpreted these developments as evidence that Egypt was returning to the reliable patterns of behavior that had made the empire such a valuable ally for previous generations. Diplomatic gifts began flowing into Egyptian treasuries from kingdoms throughout the ancient Near East as rulers sought to renew relationships that had been strained during the Amarna period. Trade agreements that had lapsed during Akhenaten's reign were renegotiated on terms favorable to Egyptian interests. Most importantly, the military alliances that formed the foundation of Egyptian imperial power were strengthened through renewed diplomatic engagement that reflected Egypt's restored commitment to traditional strategic principles. Yet even as Tiye successfully managed these multiple restoration projects, she faced a personal challenge that would test her political skills in ways she had never before experienced. Young Tutankhamun was growing into an intelligent and capable ruler who naturally began asserting greater independence as he gained confidence and experience. The collaborative relationship that had served them both so well during the early years of his reign gradually evolved into something more complex as the young pharaoh developed his own ideas about Egyptian policy and governance. This transition from regency to independent rule required incredibly delicate management because any appearance of conflict between Queen Mother and Pharaoh could have destabilized the entire governmental structure that Tiye had worked so hard to construct. She needed to allow Tutankhamun sufficient authority to establish his own credibility, while maintaining enough influence to prevent potentially disastrous policy mistakes that could undo decades of careful diplomatic and administrative work. Tiye's solution to this delicate succession challenge demonstrated the same masterful political instincts that had guided her through decades of Egyptian leadership. Rather than clinging to power or attempting to micromanage every decision her grandson made, she began implementing what we might recognize as a sophisticated mentorship withdrawal strategy. She gradually reduced her direct involvement in day-to-day governmental operations while maintaining strategic oversight of the most crucial policy areas that could affect Egypt's long-term stability. The process began with careful delegation of specific responsibilities that would allow Tutankhamun to demonstrate his capabilities without risking catastrophic mistakes. Military operations in relatively stable regions were transferred to his direct authority, giving him opportunities to build relationships with key commanders while avoiding the kind of high-stakes conflicts that could seriously damage Egyptian prestige if mishandled. Diplomatic negotiations with smaller allied kingdoms provided additional chances for the young pharaoh to develop his skills in international relations without jeopardizing Egypt's most important strategic partnerships. But Tiye's most brilliant innovation during this period involved creating what amounted to a reverse mentorship system, where Tutankhamun's growing expertise in certain areas actually enhanced her own effectiveness in others. The young pharaoh's natural affinity for military strategy complemented her diplomatic experience in ways that strengthened Egypt's overall strategic position. His fresh perspective on administrative efficiency helped identify bureaucratic inefficiencies that decades of accumulated tradition had obscured from her more experienced view. One particularly revealing example of this collaborative evolution occurred in 1332 BCE when Egyptian intelligence sources reported unusual military activity in the Hittite kingdom that suggested possible preparation for major territorial expansion. Traditional Egyptian response would have involved immediate mobilization of defensive forces along potentially threatened border regions, a costly and provocative measure that could easily escalate into full-scale warfare. But the combination of Tiye's diplomatic wisdom and Tutankhamun's military instincts produced a far more sophisticated strategy. Instead of responding with obvious defensive preparations that might have convinced Hittite leaders that war was inevitable, they orchestrated a carefully coordinated campaign of diplomatic pressure and strategic positioning that demonstrated Egyptian strength while providing face-saving alternatives to military confrontation. Tiye initiated discreet diplomatic contacts with Hittite allies and vassal states, subtly reminding them of the economic benefits they derived from peaceful relations with Egypt. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun authorized limited military exercises in regions far from the potential conflict zone, activities that would be reported by Hittite intelligence sources but would not appear directly threatening to Hittite territorial interests. The message was clear, but not provocative. Egypt remained fully capable of defending its interests, while preferring peaceful resolution of any potential disputes. The strategy succeeded brilliantly. Within months, Hittite military preparations had scaled back to normal levels, and diplomatic communications resumed their usual patterns of cautious but respectful negotiation. More importantly, other foreign powers throughout the region took note of how skillfully Egypt had managed this potential crisis. Rather than seeing weakness in Egypt's preference for diplomatic solutions, they recognized sophisticated strength that made Egyptian friendship even more valuable and Egyptian enmity even more dangerous to contemplate. But managing international relations represented only one dimension of the complex partnership that was evolving between Tiye and Tutankhamun. The domestic challenges of completing Egypt's recovery from the Amarna period required equally careful coordination between the Queen Mother's institutional knowledge and the young pharaoh's fresh energy for reform and restoration. The most sensitive aspect of this domestic agenda involved addressing the economic disruptions that Akhenaten's reign had created throughout Egyptian society. Years of irregular tax collection, disrupted trade relationships, and massive expenditures on Amarna's construction projects had created serious financial imbalances that threatened Egypt's ability to maintain its imperial obligations. Traditional solutions might have involved increasing tribute demands on vassal territories or implementing new tax burdens on Egyptian citizens, approaches that could have triggered widespread unrest or territorial rebellion. Instead, Tiye and Tutankhamun developed an innovative economic recovery strategy that combined administrative reform with strategic investment in projects that would stimulate long-term prosperity. Rather than simply demanding more resources from existing sources, they focused on expanding Egypt's economic base through initiatives that would create new wealth while addressing accumulated social problems. The centerpiece of this economic strategy involved a massive temple restoration program that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Rebuilding religious complexes that had been neglected during the Amarna period provided employment for thousands of skilled craftsmen, laborers, and support workers who had struggled economically during the previous reign's disruptions. The restored temples would eventually generate significant revenue through religious offerings, festival tourism, and associated commercial activities. Most importantly, the visible commitment to religious restoration helped heal the social divisions that Akhenaten's theological innovations had created. But the temple restoration program also demonstrated how effectively Tiye and Tutankhamun had learned to coordinate their different strengths. The Queen Mother's decades of experience with large-scale administrative projects proved invaluable in organizing the complex logistics required to coordinate construction activities across dozens of sites throughout the empire. Her established relationships with provincial governors, local religious authorities, and skilled craftsman guilds ensured that projects moved forward efficiently, without the kind of bureaucratic delays that typically plagued major governmental initiatives. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun's personal involvement in ceremonial aspects of the restoration program provided exactly the kind of visible royal leadership that helped convince Egyptian citizens that their traditional way of life was being restored and protected. His participation in temple dedication ceremonies, his personal inspection of construction sites, and his direct conversations with workers and craftsmen demonstrated that the royal family remained committed to the welfare of ordinary Egyptians rather than pursuing abstract theological experiments that benefited only elite intellectual circles. The success of this collaborative approach became apparent in the remarkable speed with which Egyptian society began recovering from the trauma of the Amarna period. Archaeological evidence shows that by 1330 BCE, just 6 years after Tutankhamun's accession, economic activity throughout Egypt had not only returned to pre-Amarna levels, but had actually exceeded them in many regions. Trade relationships with foreign partners had been fully restored. Tribute payments from vassal territories were flowing regularly into Egyptian treasuries, and domestic prosperity was generating tax revenues that allowed for ambitious new construction projects. More importantly, the social cohesion that had been so badly damaged by Akhenaten's revolutionary policies was healing in ways that suggested lasting stability rather than temporary improvement. Religious festivals that had been banned or severely restricted during the Amarna period were being celebrated with renewed enthusiasm that reflected genuine popular support rather than mere governmental mandate. Artistic production was flourishing as craftsmen rediscovered traditional techniques, while also incorporating innovative elements that reflected their experiences during the period of theological experimentation. But perhaps the most significant indicator of Egypt's successful recovery was the international reaction to these domestic improvements. Foreign ambassadors reported to their home governments that Egypt appeared stronger and more unified than it had been for decades. Military observers noted that Egyptian forces were displaying levels of coordination and effectiveness that suggested excellent morale and professional competence. Trade representatives found Egyptian markets more prosperous and reliable than they had experienced during the uncertain years of Akhenaten's reign. This international confidence in Egypt's restored stability produced tangible benefits that reinforced the success of Tiye and Tutankhamun's collaborative leadership. Diplomatic initiatives that might have been dismissed as unrealistic during the Amarna period were now taken seriously by foreign courts that recognized Egypt's renewed capacity to deliver on its commitments. Trade agreements were negotiated on terms more favorable to Egyptian interests because partners valued access to Egypt's restored prosperity. Military alliances were strengthened as potential enemies recognized that Egypt had regained the institutional coherence necessary for effective strategic action. Yet even as these external successes validated their collaborative approach, Tiye faced a personal challenge that would test her political wisdom in ways she had never before experienced. By 1328 BCE, Tutankhamun had developed into a genuinely capable and confident ruler who no longer needed the kind of close guidance that had been essential during his early years on the throne. The young pharaoh was making independent decisions that reflected sound judgment and political sophistication. His military commanders respected his strategic insights, his administrators implemented his policies efficiently, and his diplomatic initiatives were achieving their intended objectives. In most political systems, this kind of successful leadership development would be celebrated as an unqualified triumph. A mentor who had successfully guided a protégé to independent competence would normally expect to retire with honor and satisfaction, confident that their legacy was secure in capable hands. But ancient Egyptian royal politics operated according to different rules that made such straightforward transitions far more complicated and potentially dangerous. The fundamental problem was that Tiye's decades of behind-the-scenes leadership had created expectations and relationships that could not simply be transferred to another person, even one as capable as Tutankhamun. Foreign rulers who had grown accustomed to dealing with her personally were uncertain about whether the young pharaoh would honor commitments and understandings that predated his independent authority. Provincial governors who had learned to rely on her institutional knowledge were nervous about navigating complex administrative challenges without her guidance. Military commanders who had developed personal loyalty to her leadership style were unsure about how their relationships with royal authority might change under purely pharaonic direction. More problematically, there were individuals throughout the Egyptian power structure who had built their own careers on access to Tiye's influence and who might view her reduced role as a threat to their own positions. These were not necessarily disloyal or incompetent people, but their personal interests had become intertwined with the existing power arrangements in ways that could create instability if those arrangements changed too rapidly or dramatically. Tiye's solution to this delicate transition challenge reflected the same sophisticated political instincts that had served her so well throughout her remarkable career. Rather than attempting to maintain her previous level of direct involvement in governmental operations, she began repositioning herself as what we might recognize as an elder stateswoman whose counsel would be available when needed, but whose day-to-day responsibilities would be substantially reduced. The key to making this transition work was ensuring that Tutankhamun's authority was enhanced rather than diminished by her continued presence in the royal court. Instead of appearing to compete with the young pharaoh for influence or recognition, she needed to become a resource that strengthened his position while allowing him to develop his own independent relationships with key constituencies throughout Egyptian society. This required incredible personal discipline because it meant deliberately reducing her own visible role in many of the activities that had defined her identity for decades. Diplomatic meetings that she had previously conducted personally were transferred to Tutankhamun's direct authority, with her participation limited to background briefings and post-meeting consultations. Administrative decisions that had routinely required her approval were delegated to established bureaucratic procedures that functioned independently of royal micromanagement. Military planning sessions that had benefited from her strategic insights were restructured to emphasize the pharaoh's command authority while preserving access to her accumulated expertise when specifically requested. The most challenging aspect of this transition involved managing the expectations of foreign rulers who had grown accustomed to dealing with Tiye as Egypt's primary decision-maker. These relationships represented decades of careful cultivation that could not simply be abandoned without risking serious damage to Egypt's international position. Yet continuing them in their previous form would undermine Tutankhamun's credibility as an independent pharaoh capable of conducting Egyptian foreign policy without constant supervision. Tiye's approach to this diplomatic challenge demonstrated her characteristic blend of practical wisdom and innovative thinking. Rather than abruptly ending her international correspondence or forcing foreign rulers to adjust immediately to new protocols, she began a gradual process of transitioning these relationships in ways that actually enhanced Egypt's diplomatic position. The process began with carefully orchestrated joint meetings where foreign ambassadors could interact with both Tiye and Tutankhamun simultaneously, observing their collaborative decision-making process and developing confidence in the young pharaoh's capabilities while maintaining their established comfort level with the Queen Mother's involvement. These sessions provided opportunities for Tutankhamun to demonstrate his mastery of complex international issues while benefiting from Tiye's decades of experience in reading the subtle diplomatic signals that could make the difference between successful and failed negotiations. Gradually, as foreign representatives became more comfortable with Tutankhamun's diplomatic skills, the balance of these interactions shifted toward greater pharaonic leadership while preserving Tiye's availability for consultation on particularly sensitive or complex matters. The result was a transition that actually strengthened Egypt's international relationships by demonstrating governmental continuity and institutional depth, rather than suggesting any weakness or instability in Egyptian leadership. One particularly successful example of this transitional diplomacy occurred in 1327 BCE, when a succession crisis in the kingdom of Mitanni created opportunities for Egyptian influence, but also risks of military entanglement that could have diverted resources from domestic reconstruction projects. Traditional Egyptian policy would have involved either immediate military intervention to support preferred candidates or complete non-involvement that might have allowed hostile forces to gain control of strategically important territories. But the combination of Tiye's diplomatic experience and Tutankhamun's military instincts produced a more sophisticated approach that maximized Egyptian influence while minimizing risks and costs. Instead of committing Egyptian forces directly to Mitannian internal conflicts, they orchestrated a complex strategy of selective support for different factions that prevented any single group from achieving complete victory, while ensuring that Egyptian interests would be protected regardless of the ultimate outcome. The strategy required incredibly delicate coordination because it involved multiple simultaneous negotiations with competing Mitannian leaders, each of whom needed to believe that Egypt was their most reliable partner, while none could be allowed to gain sufficient confidence to act independently of Egyptian guidance. Tiye's decades of experience in managing such complex diplomatic balancing acts proved invaluable in designing the overall approach, while Tutankhamun's fresh perspective helped identify innovative tactics that older diplomatic traditions might not have considered. The results exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Within 18 months, Mitannian's succession crisis had been resolved in ways that left Egypt with over the kingdom's significantly enhanced influence's future policies, while requiring minimal expenditure of Egyptian resources. More importantly, the sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering that had produced this success impressed other foreign rulers with Egypt's renewed strategic capabilities and institutional depth. But managing international relations represented only one dimension of the complex process through which Tiye was transitioning from active leadership to elder statesmanship. The domestic aspects of this transition required equally careful attention because they involved relationships and expectations that had developed over decades of collaborative governance between the Queen Mother and various Egyptian constituencies. The religious establishment presented particularly sensitive challenges because many traditional priests had developed personal relationships with Tiye during the difficult years when they had relied on her protection against Akhenaten's theological persecution. These religious leaders naturally looked to her for continued guidance as they worked to complete the restoration of traditional practices and rebuild institutional structures that had been damaged during the Amarna period. Yet allowing these relationships to continue unchanged would have undermined Tutankhamun's authority as pharaoh and supreme religious leader of Egyptian society. Traditional Egyptian theology emphasized the divine nature of pharaonic authority, and any appearance that religious decisions were being made by someone other than the pharaoh could have created theological contradictions that would weaken the entire social foundation of Egyptian civilization. Tiye's solution to this religious transition challenge reflected her deep understanding of Egyptian theological principles and her practical wisdom about human nature. Rather than simply transferring her religious relationships to Tutankhamun, which might have seemed artificial and could have created resentment among priests who valued their personal connections with her, she began repositioning her role in ways that actually enhanced pharaonic religious authority while preserving the benefits of her accumulated experience and established relationships. The process began with subtle changes in the ceremonial protocols that governed her participation in religious activities. Instead of appearing to direct religious ceremonies or make independent theological decisions, she began functioning as what we might recognize as a senior advisor whose presence validated Tutankhamun's religious leadership, while providing continuity with traditional practices that predated the Amarna disruption. This approach proved remarkably effective because it satisfied multiple constituencies simultaneously. Traditional priests felt reassured that their established relationships with Tiye remained intact and that her accumulated wisdom would continue to influence religious policy. Tutankhamun gained credibility as supreme religious leader, while benefiting from association with the Queen Mother's well-established reputation for theological orthodoxy. Most importantly, ordinary Egyptians could observe visible continuity in religious leadership that suggested their traditional way of life was being restored and protected by competent authority figures who understood and respected ancient customs. The success of this religious transition became apparent in the remarkable renaissance of traditional Egyptian religious expression that characterized the later years of Tutankhamun's reign. Temples that had been closed or neglected during the Amarna period were not only physically restored, but became centers of renewed spiritual activity that reflected genuine popular enthusiasm rather than mere governmental mandate. Religious festivals that had been banned or severely restricted during Akhenaten's reign returned with elaborate celebrations that demonstrated the depth of Egyptian commitment to their ancestral traditions. More importantly, the theological innovations that had caused such social disruption during the previous reign were peacefully abandoned without creating new conflicts or resentments. The transition back to traditional polytheistic worship occurred so smoothly that foreign observers commented on Egypt's remarkable social cohesion and institutional stability. Rather than appearing to represent weakness or indecision, the religious restoration was interpreted internationally as evidence of Egypt's renewed confidence and cultural authenticity. But completing the religious restoration represented only one aspect of the comprehensive domestic recovery that Tiye and Tutankhamun were orchestrating during these crucial years. The administrative challenges of rebuilding efficient governmental operations after years of Amarna period disruption required equally careful attention and coordination between the Queen Mother's institutional knowledge and the young pharaoh's energy for reform and innovation. The most complex administrative challenge involved reconciling the accumulated legal precedents and bureaucratic procedures that had developed during Akhenaten's reign with the traditional Egyptian governmental systems that were being restored under Tutankhamun's leadership. Years of contradictory royal decrees, experimental administrative structures, and theological innovations had created a maze of conflicting authorities and unclear jurisdictions that threatened to paralyze efficient governmental operations if not carefully resolved. Traditional approaches to such administrative cleanup might have involved simply declaring all Amarna period innovations null and void, returning immediately to pre-Akhenaten governmental procedures regardless of practical consequences. But Tiye recognized that such dramatic reversals could create new problems by invalidating thousands of individual decisions, property transfers, and legal arrangements that had been made during the previous reign according to then valid procedures. Instead, she and Tutankhamun developed what amounted to a comprehensive governmental reconciliation process that preserved beneficial innovations from the Amarna period while eliminating problematic elements and restoring traditional structures that had proven their effectiveness over centuries of successful Egyptian administration. This required incredibly detailed work because it involved reviewing thousands of individual cases and determining which precedents should be maintained, which should be modified, and which should be completely abandoned. The process began with the establishment of special administrative courts, staffed by experienced legal scholars who possessed expertise in both traditional Egyptian law and the innovations that had been introduced during Akhenaten's reign. These courts were empowered to review disputed cases and establish consistent precedents that would guide future administrative decisions while resolving accumulated conflicts that had created uncertainty and inefficiency throughout the governmental system. But the real genius of this administrative reconciliation lay in how it was structured to enhance rather than compete with Tutankhamun's pharaonic authority. Rather than appearing to impose solutions independently, the special courts functioned as advisory bodies that prepared recommendations for royal approval. This meant that every significant administrative decision ultimately reflected pharaonic judgment, while benefiting from expert analysis and institutional memory that no individual ruler could possibly possess independently. The results of this careful administrative restoration exceeded even Tiye's optimistic expectations. Within 3 years, Egyptian governmental operations had achieved levels of efficiency and consistency that actually surpassed pre-Amarna standards. Provincial administration functioned smoothly, tax collection proceeded regularly, and legal disputes were resolved according to predictable procedures that citizens could understand and trust. More importantly, the entire process had strengthened rather than weakened Tutankhamun's royal authority by demonstrating his commitment to justice, efficiency, and respect for Egyptian legal traditions. Yet even as these domestic successes validated their collaborative approach to governmental restoration, Tiye faced the reality that her own role in Egyptian politics would necessarily continue evolving as Tutankhamun matured into full independent leadership. By 1325 BCE, the young pharaoh had demonstrated conclusively that he possessed the skills, judgment, and institutional support necessary to rule Egypt effectively without constant guidance or supervision. This successful leadership development represented the culmination of everything Tiye had worked to achieve since first recognizing that her son Akhenaten's revolutionary tendencies would require careful management to protect Egyptian stability. She had successfully guided Egypt through the most dangerous period in its imperial history, preserved the essential institutions that made Egyptian civilization possible, and transferred power to a capable successor who shared her commitment to Egyptian prosperity and greatness. But the very success of this transition created new challenges that would test her political wisdom in unexpected ways. As Tutankhamun's independent authority became more established and his personal relationships with key constituencies grew stronger, there were subtle but unmistakable signs that some individuals within the Egyptian power structure were beginning to view Tiye's continued presence as potentially unnecessary or even problematic. These were not necessarily people who opposed her personally or questioned her past contributions to Egyptian success. Rather, they were ambitious officials, military commanders, and religious leaders who recognized that their own advancement might be enhanced by demonstrating primary loyalty to the reigning pharaoh rather than maintaining divided allegiances between present and past sources of authority. The challenge was particularly acute because Tiye's decades of behind-the-scenes leadership had created a complex web of personal relationships, informal understandings, and established procedures that could not simply be transferred to another person without risking serious disruption to Egyptian governmental operations. Yet maintaining these relationships unchanged would inevitably create the appearance that real authority continued to reside with the Queen Mother rather than with the pharaoh, an impression that could undermine Tutankhamun's credibility and potentially encourage challenges to his leadership. Tiye's response to this delicate situation would demonstrate once again why she'd become the most successful political strategist in Egyptian history. Rather than attempting to preserve her existing influence through direct confrontation with changing political realities, she began implementing what amounted to a strategic withdrawal that would actually enhance her long-term legacy while strengthening Tutankhamun's independent authority. The process began with her carefully orchestrated decision to reduce her physical presence in the primary royal residences where day-to-day governmental business was conducted. Instead of maintaining her previous pattern of constant availability for consultation and decision-making, she began spending increasing amounts of time at secondary palace complexes where she could maintain dignity and comfort while avoiding any appearance of competing with Tutankhamun for influence or attention. But this strategic withdrawal was far from a simple retirement. Instead, Tiye was repositioning herself to function as what we might recognize as a strategic reserve, whose accumulated expertise and established relationships would remain available during genuine crises, while allowing normal governmental operations to proceed without her direct involvement. This meant that Tutankhamun could demonstrate independent leadership capabilities, while knowing that he retained access to the most experienced political advisor in Egyptian history should circumstances require her unique skills. The strategic brilliance of this arrangement became apparent in 1323 BCE, when Egypt faced what could have been its most serious international crisis since the Hittite conflicts of the previous decade. Intelligence reports from Egyptian agents operating in Mesopotamia brought disturbing news that a coalition of Assyrian and Babylonian forces was preparing coordinated attacks on Egyptian territories in the Levant. These weren't simple border raids or opportunistic incursions. This appeared to be a carefully planned campaign designed to test whether Egypt's apparent governmental transition had created exploitable weaknesses. Under normal circumstances, such intelligence would have triggered immediate consultations between the pharaoh and his senior military advisors, followed by complex diplomatic initiatives aimed at disrupting the enemy coalition before it could achieve operational effectiveness. But these weren't normal circumstances. Tutankhamun had been ruling independently for several years and had successfully managed numerous smaller crises without requiring assistance from Tiye. His military commanders respected his strategic judgment, his diplomatic corps had confidence in his negotiating skills, and his administrative apparatus functioned efficiently under his direct authority. Yet this particular crisis involved exactly the kind of multidimensional challenge that had made Tiye's behind-the-scenes leadership so valuable during previous decades. The threatened Assyrian-Babylonian coalition represented more than a simple military problem. It reflected shifting power relationships throughout the ancient Near East that could affect Egypt's long-term strategic position, regardless of immediate battlefield outcomes. More importantly, the timing of this threat suggested that foreign enemies were deliberately testing Egypt's institutional stability during what they perceived as a vulnerable leadership transition. Tutankhamun's initial response demonstrated both his growing competence and the limitations that any individual ruler faces when confronting complex international challenges. His immediate military preparations were entirely appropriate, involving the mobilization of border garrisons, the positioning of reserve forces in strategic locations, and the implementation of enhanced intelligence gathering operations throughout potentially threatened territories. His diplomatic initiatives were equally sound, including direct communications with Egyptian allies who might provide support, and indirect approaches to potential coalition members who might be persuaded to withdraw from hostile activities. But as reports continued arriving from Egyptian agents throughout Mesopotamia, it became increasingly clear that this crisis involved complexities that exceeded the scope of conventional military and diplomatic responses. The Assyrian-Babylonian coalition wasn't simply an opportunistic alliance between neighboring kingdoms seeking territorial expansion. Instead, intelligence sources suggested a far more sophisticated strategy aimed at fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout the entire region. The coalition appeared to be coordinating with disaffected elements within Egyptian vassal territories, particularly in Syria and Palestine, where local rulers had grown restive under imperial taxation and administrative oversight. Simultaneously, Diplomatic contacts were being established with Nubian chieftains who retained bitter memories of previous Egyptian military campaigns and might be willing to open southern fronts that would force Egypt to divide its military resources. Most ominously, there were indications that Hittite representatives were observing these developments with considerable interest, possibly preparing to exploit any Egyptian weaknesses that coalition attacks might reveal. Faced with this multidimensional threat, Tutankhamun made a decision that reflected both political wisdom and personal confidence in his relationship with Tiye. Rather than attempting to manage every aspect of this crisis independently, he requested her counsel on strategic options that might not be apparent from conventional military and diplomatic perspectives. This wasn't an admission of inadequacy or an abandonment of pharaonic authority. Instead, it represented exactly the kind of mature leadership judgment that distinguished truly effective rulers from those who allowed personal pride to compromise national interests. Tiye's response to this request demonstrated why her decades of international experience remained invaluable despite her reduced day-to-day involvement in Egyptian governmental operations. Within hours of receiving detailed briefings on the developing crisis, she had identified strategic opportunities that had escaped the attention of younger advisors whose focus had been concentrated on immediate military preparations and conventional diplomatic approaches. Her analysis began with a fundamental insight about the motivations driving the Assyrian-Babylonian coalition. Rather than viewing this alliance as evidence of enemy strength, she recognized it as a potential indicator of weakness that could be exploited through sophisticated political warfare. The very fact that these traditionally competitive kingdoms had found it necessary to coordinate their efforts suggested that neither felt capable of challenging Egypt independently. This meant that disrupting their cooperation might be more effective than attempting to defeat their combined forces through direct military confrontation. But Tiye's strategic recommendation went far beyond simple diplomatic efforts to split the enemy coalition. She proposed a comprehensive approach that would simultaneously address immediate military threats while strengthening Egypt's long-term strategic position throughout the region. The key was recognizing that this crisis represented an opportunity to demonstrate Egyptian strength and resolve in ways that would discourage future challenges, while avoiding the enormous costs associated with prolonged military campaigns. The strategy she outlined involved 3 coordinated components that would unfold simultaneously across multiple theaters of operation. First, carefully targeted military strikes would demonstrate Egyptian capability and resolve while avoiding escalation that might unite enemy forces or draw additional opponents into the conflict. Second, sophisticated diplomatic initiatives would exploit existing tensions within the enemy coalition while offering face-saving alternatives to continued hostility. Third, economic measures would demonstrate Egypt's ability to reward cooperation and punish opposition in ways that transcended immediate military considerations. The military component of Tiye's strategy reflected her deep understanding of Egyptian capabilities and limitations developed through decades of crisis management. Rather than recommending massive mobilizations that would strain Egyptian resources while potentially alarming neutral kingdoms throughout the region, she proposed precision operations designed to achieve maximum psychological impact through minimal force deployment. The centerpiece of this approach involved coordinated raids against specific Assyrian and Babylonian supply depots, communication centers, and administrative facilities that supported their coalition planning efforts. These weren't random destructive attacks aimed at causing general damage. Instead, they were surgical strikes designed to demonstrate that Egyptian intelligence had penetrated enemy operations so thoroughly that nowhere within coalition territory could be considered secure from Egyptian retaliation. Simultaneously, Egyptian naval forces would implement carefully calibrated interference with maritime trade routes that connected coalition territories with potential external supporters. Again, this wasn't indiscriminate economic warfare that might have drawn neutral kingdoms into the conflict. Instead, it involved selective disruption of specific commercial relationships that directly supported coalition military preparations, while leaving general trade patterns largely undisturbed. The diplomatic component of Tiye's strategy demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of the complex motivations and relationships that shaped ancient Near Eastern international politics. Rather than simply attempting to bribe individual coalition members to abandon their allies, she proposed exploiting fundamental contradictions within the alliance that made long-term cooperation inherently unstable. The key insight was recognizing that Assyrian and Babylonian strategic interests were ultimately incompatible despite their temporary cooperation against Egypt. Assyrian expansion ambitions focused primarily on controlling trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia and the Mediterranean coast. Babylonian priorities emphasized securing agricultural territories and tribute relationships that would support their growing urban population. These different objectives meant that successful coalition operations against Egypt would inevitably create new sources of conflict between the allies as they competed for control over captured territories and resources. Tiye's diplomatic approach involved subtly highlighting these contradictions through carefully orchestrated communications with individual coalition leaders that emphasized the long-term costs of continued cooperation with unreliable allies. Simultaneously, Egyptian diplomatic agents would offer alternative arrangements that addressed legitimate Assyrian and Babylonian concerns while preserving Egyptian strategic interests. The goal wasn't necessarily immediate alliance dissolution, but rather the creation of sufficient internal tensions that coalition military effectiveness would be compromised even if formal cooperation continued. The economic component of Tiye's comprehensive strategy reflected her understanding that ancient warfare was ultimately about resources, and that sustainable military campaigns required reliable access to materials, supplies, and financial support that transcended immediate battlefield considerations. Egypt's enormous wealth provided opportunities for economic warfare that could be more decisive than conventional military operations, while avoiding the human costs and political risks associated with large-scale combat. The approach involved coordinated manipulation of trade relationships, tribute arrangements, and commercial partnerships that connected coalition territories with broader regional economic networks. Egyptian merchants, who maintained business relationships throughout the ancient Near East, would subtly adjust their trading patterns in ways that made essential supplies more expensive and difficult to obtain for coalition supporters, while ensuring that neutral or friendly kingdoms continued receiving favorable access to Egyptian goods and services. Simultaneously, Egypt would offer enhanced economic incentives to vassal territories that had shown signs of restiveness, demonstrating that loyalty to Egyptian authority produced tangible benefits that exceeded any advantages that might be gained through rebellion or defection to enemy coalitions. This wasn't simple bribery, but rather a systematic demonstration of Egypt's capacity to reward cooperation and punish opposition through economic means that complemented military and diplomatic pressures. The implementation of Tiye's comprehensive strategy required the kind of complex coordination between military, diplomatic, and economic activities that had made her behind-the-scenes leadership so valuable during previous crises. But this time, the coordination would be managed by Tutankhamun under her strategic guidance rather than through her direct operational control. This arrangement would demonstrate pharaonic leadership capabilities while benefiting from her accumulated expertise and established relationships. The military operations began within weeks of the strategic decision, with Egyptian forces launching precisely targeted raids that caught coalition planners completely off guard. Intelligence networks that had taken months to establish were disrupted overnight. Supply depots that had been considered secure were destroyed before their contents could be distributed to coalition forces. Communication systems that connected Assyrian and Babylonian command centers experienced systematic interference that made coordinated planning increasingly difficult. But the psychological impact of these military operations exceeded their immediate tactical effectiveness. Coalition leaders who had been confident about their intelligence security and logistical preparations suddenly realized that Egyptian capabilities far exceeded their expectations. More importantly, the precision and coordination of Egyptian attacks demonstrated institutional competence that contradicted enemy assumptions about governmental weakness during Egypt's leadership transition. The diplomatic component of the strategy produced equally impressive results, as Tiye's analysis of coalition vulnerabilities proved remarkably accurate. Within months of the crisis beginning, intelligence reports indicated growing tensions between Assyrian and Babylonian leadership over resource allocation, operational priorities, and post-victory territorial arrangements that had never been adequately resolved during initial alliance negotiations. Egyptian diplomatic agents expertly exploited these emerging divisions by providing each coalition partner with intelligence about their allies' secret communications and independent diplomatic initiatives. Simultaneously, they offered alternative arrangements that addressed legitimate concerns while avoiding direct confrontation with Egyptian interests. The cumulative effect was growing suspicion and recrimination within the coalition that undermined military cooperation even when the formal alliance agreements remained technically intact. The economic warfare component proved perhaps most effective of all, as Egypt's vast commercial networks provided opportunities for pressure that coalition leaders had never anticipated. Essential supplies became increasingly expensive and unreliable as Egyptian merchants adjusted their trading patterns according to carefully coordinated plans. Vassal territories that had shown interest in supporting coalition activities discovered that rebellion carried economic costs that exceeded any potential benefits from successful military operations. More importantly, the economic incentives that Egypt offered to loyal territories created visible demonstrations of the benefits that flowed from continued cooperation with Egyptian authority. Tribute arrangements were renegotiated on more favorable terms, trade opportunities were expanded, and development projects were initiated that provided tangible improvements in living standards for populations that might otherwise have been tempted by coalition promises of liberation from imperial control. The combined effect of these coordinated military, diplomatic, and economic pressures became apparent within 6 months as the Assyrian-Babylonian coalition began experiencing the internal contradictions that Tiye had predicted from the beginning. Coalition military operations that had initially proceeded according to carefully developed plans became increasingly hesitant and poorly coordinated as logistical problems, communication difficulties, and strategic disagreements undermined effective cooperation. By early 1322 BCE, intelligence reports indicated that formal alliance meetings between Assyrian and Babylonian leadership had devolved into recrimination sessions, where each partner blamed the other for operational failures and unmet commitments. Simultaneously, both kingdoms were pursuing independent diplomatic initiatives aimed at securing separate peace arrangements with Egypt that would allow them to withdraw from coalition activities without completely losing face. The success of Tiye's strategic approach exceeded even her optimistic expectations, as what had initially appeared to be Egypt's most serious international crisis in decades dissolved into an opportunity to demonstrate renewed strength and competence that actually enhanced Egyptian prestige throughout the ancient Near East. Coalition military forces that had threatened Egyptian territories were withdrawn to defend against continuing Egyptian raids and economic pressures. Vassal territories that had shown signs of restiveness renewed their loyalty commitments with greater enthusiasm than they had displayed for years. Most importantly, neutral kingdoms throughout the region took careful note of Egypt's sophisticated crisis management capabilities and renewed their interest in maintaining positive relationships with such a formidable neighbor. But perhaps the most significant outcome of this crisis was its demonstration that the collaborative relationship between Tiye and Tutankhamun had evolved into something even more effective than her previous pattern of behind-the-scenes leadership. The young pharaoh had successfully managed the most complex international challenge of his reign, while benefiting from strategic guidance that enhanced rather than diminished his authority. Foreign observers who had been watching for signs of Egyptian weakness during the leadership transition instead witnessed a display of institutional depth and strategic sophistication that exceeded anything they had seen from Egypt in decades. The international reaction to Egypt's crisis management success produced immediate diplomatic and economic benefits that reinforced the effectiveness of Tiye's strategic withdrawal from day-to-day governmental operations. Kingdoms that had maintained cautious neutrality during the Assyrian-Babylonian threat rushed to renew alliance agreements and expand trade relationships with Egypt. Tribute payments from vassal territories increased as local rulers competed to demonstrate their loyalty and reliability. Most importantly, potential enemies throughout the region concluded that challenging Egyptian authority would be far more difficult and dangerous than they had previously assumed. Yet even as these external successes validated the wisdom of Tiye's evolving role in Egyptian politics, she faced new personal challenges that would test her political instincts in ways she had never before experienced. By 1321 BCE, Tutankhamun had clearly established himself as a capable and confident ruler who commanded genuine respect from his military commanders, administrative officials, and religious authorities. His marriage to his half-sister Ankhesenamun had produced the kind of royal partnership that provided both personal happiness and political stability. Most importantly, he had successfully managed multiple crises without requiring the kind of intensive guidance that had been necessary during his early years on the throne. This successful leadership development represented everything that Tiye had worked to achieve, since first recognizing that Egypt needed institutional continuity that could survive the disruptions created by Akhenaten's revolutionary experimentation. She had preserved Egyptian civilization during its most dangerous period, guided the restoration of traditional practices and governmental structures, and successfully transferred power to a competent successor who shared her commitment to Egyptian greatness. But the very completeness of this success created unexpected emotional and psychological challenges that had never been part of her strategic planning. For over 30 years, her identity had been defined by her central role in protecting and advancing Egyptian interests through whatever combination of behind-the-scenes influence, diplomatic maneuvering, and crisis management might be required by changing circumstances. Now, for the first time since her marriage to Amenhotep III, she found herself genuinely unnecessary for Egypt's day-to-day prosperity and security. The transition from indispensable advisor to respected elder stateswoman required personal adjustments that proved more difficult than any international crisis she had ever managed. The palace complexes where she had spent decades orchestrating Egyptian policy now functioned efficiently without her constant attention. The diplomatic correspondence that had once required her personal review was being handled competently by younger officials who had learned from her example but no longer needed her guidance. The military planning sessions that had benefited from her strategic insights now proceeded under Tutankhamun's direct authority, with results that matched or exceeded anything achieved during her period of active leadership. Most challenging of all was the gradual recognition that her accumulated expertise, while still valuable during genuine emergencies, was becoming less relevant to the changing realities of Egyptian governance under Tutankhamun's increasingly confident leadership. The young pharaoh's approach to international relations reflected lessons learned from her mentorship, but also incorporated fresh perspectives and innovative techniques that sometimes produced better results than traditional methods might have achieved. This wasn't a matter of being replaced or rejected, which would have created clear emotional frameworks for understanding her changing circumstances. Instead, it was the more complex experience of discovering that successful mentorship inevitably makes the mentor less necessary, even when the relationship remains warm and respectful. Tutankhamun continued seeking her counsel on particularly sensitive matters and regularly expressed gratitude for her decades of guidance and protection. But both of them understood that Egypt's future prosperity depended on his ability to function independently rather than continuing to rely on her accumulated wisdom and established relationships. Tiye's response to this personal transition demonstrated the same combination of practical wisdom and emotional intelligence that had made her such an effective political strategist throughout her remarkable career. Rather than attempting to maintain relevance through interference in governmental operations that no longer required her involvement, she began developing new ways to contribute to Egyptian prosperity that complemented rather than competed with Tutankhamun's pharaonic authority. The most significant of these new activities involved what we might recognize as a comprehensive institutional memory preservation project, aimed at ensuring that future Egyptian leaders would have access to the accumulated knowledge and experience that had made Egypt's recovery from the Amarna crisis possible. This wasn't simply a matter of recording historical events or compiling administrative procedures, though both of those activities were important components of the overall effort. Instead, Tiye began systematically documenting the subtle political insights, diplomatic techniques, and strategic principles that couldn't be learned from official records or formal training programs. These were the kinds of hard-won lessons about human nature, institutional dynamics, and international relations that had enabled her to navigate complex challenges that had defeated less experienced leaders. More importantly, they represented wisdom that could be invaluable to future generations of Egyptian rulers who might face similar challenges but lack access to advisors with comparable experience. The documentation process involved extensive conversations with senior officials, military commanders, and diplomatic personnel who had participated in key decisions during the most crucial periods of Egyptian history. These weren't formal interviews conducted according to rigid protocols, but rather informal discussions that NU designed to capture instant understanding that develops through years of practical experience in high-stakes political environments. Simultaneously, Tiye began working with palace scribes to compile comprehensive records of diplomatic precedents, administrative procedures, and strategic principles that had proven effective during her decades of leadership. These documents would serve as reference materials for future Egyptian leaders who needed to understand the historical context and practical considerations that should inform their decision-making processes. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Tiye's institutional memory project involved the creation of what amounted to a leadership training program for younger members of the royal family and promising officials who might someday assume positions of significant responsibility within Egyptian government. This wasn't a formal educational institution with established curricula and regular schedules, but rather an ongoing series of mentorship relationships that provided access to accumulated wisdom that couldn't be obtained through conventional learning methods. The participants in these informal training sessions included not only immediate royal family members, but also individuals from throughout Egypt's society who had demonstrated exceptional capabilities that might benefit from exposure to advanced political and strategic thinking. Provincial administrators who had shown unusual competence in managing complex challenges, military officers who had displayed innovative tactical thinking, diplomatic personnel who had achieved remarkable success in difficult negotiations, and even talented scribes and craftsmen whose work had contributed to Egyptian prosperity in unexpected ways. The curriculum of these sessions covered everything from practical administrative techniques to sophisticated diplomatic strategies, but the real value lay in the opportunity for participants to observe how experienced leadership integrated multiple considerations into effective decision-making processes. Rather than simply learning rules or procedures, they gained insight into the kind of flexible thinking that allowed effective leaders to adapt general principles to specific circumstances while maintaining consistency with long-term strategic objectives. One particularly promising participant in these training sessions was a young military officer named Horemheb, who had distinguished himself during several border conflicts and had shown unusual aptitude for both tactical innovation and strategic planning. Under Tiye's mentorship, Horemheb was developing the kind of comprehensive leadership capabilities that might someday make him valuable for senior positions within Egyptian government or military command structures. But Tiye's most important protégé remained Tutankhamun himself, despite his growing independence and demonstrated competence. Their relationship had evolved from the intensive guidance of his early reign into something more resembling a strategic partnership between equals, but she continued providing counsel on particularly complex matters that benefited from her accumulated experience and institutional memory. Our relationship was tested in ways neither this evolving meant of them had anticipated when disturbing reports began arriving from Egyptian territories in Nubia during the spring of 1320 BCE. Local administrators were reporting unusual patterns of tribal movement and communication that suggested possible coordination between groups that had historically maintained competitive or hostile relationships with each other. More ominously, there were indications that some of these tribal confederations might be receiving external support from sources that remained unidentified, but appeared to possess sophisticated knowledge of Egyptian defensive capabilities and administrative procedures. The initial intelligence reports were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, making it difficult to assess whether these developments represented a genuine threat to Egyptian control over Nubian territories or simply the kind of periodic tribal tensions that had characterized the region for centuries. But several details suggested that something more serious might be developing than routine local unrest. The most concerning aspect of the situation was evidence that tribal leaders who had previously been reliable Egyptian allies were participating in communications and meetings with groups that had historically opposed Egyptian authority. This wasn't necessarily evidence of disloyalty, since diplomatic contacts between different tribal factions were normal aspects of regional politics. But the timing and scope of these interactions suggested coordination that exceeded anything seen during previous periods of tribal political activity. Simultaneously, Egyptian intelligence sources were reporting unusual patterns of weapon acquisition and military training among groups that had never previously displayed interest in organized military activities. Again, this wasn't necessarily alarming, since tribal societies naturally maintained warrior traditions and defensive capabilities. But the scale and coordination of these military preparations suggested planning for operations that would exceed the scope of traditional tribal conflicts. Most troubling of all were reports that some tribal leaders were receiving detailed information about Egyptian military positions, patrol schedules, and defensive preparations that should have been known only to authorized Egyptian personnel. This suggested either serious security breaches within Egyptian administrative structures or active collaboration between tribal groups and external enemies who possessed sophisticated intelligence capabilities. Tutankhamun's initial response to these reports reflected both his growing strategic competence and his recognition that this situation involved complexities that might benefit from Tiye's accumulated experience with Nubian affairs. Rather than immediately implementing military responses that might escalate tensions unnecessarily, he requested comprehensive analysis of the intelligence reports and strategic recommendations for addressing whatever threats might be developing. Tiye's assessment of the Nubian situation demonstrated why her institutional memory remained valuable, even as her day-to-day involvement in Egyptian governance had diminished. Her decades of experience with tribal politics, combined with her detailed knowledge of previous Egyptian policies and their long-term consequences, provided insights that weren't apparent from contemporary intelligence reports alone. Her analysis began with the recognition that the reported tribal activities reflected deeper structural problems that had been developing gradually over several years, but had been obscured by Egypt's focus on recovering from the Amarna crisis and managing international challenges, like the recent Assyrian-Babylonian coalition threat. The tribal unrest wasn't simply a spontaneous development that could be addressed through conventional military or diplomatic responses. Instead, it represented the culmination of accumulated grievances and changing regional dynamics that required comprehensive policy adjustments rather than temporary crisis management. The fundamental issue was that Egypt's traditional approach to Nubian governance had become increasingly inappropriate for managing populations that had experienced significant social and economic changes during the decades since initial Egyptian conquest. Tribal societies that had once been primarily pastoral and relatively isolated had developed more sophisticated political structures, expanded commercial relationships, and acquired greater awareness of alternatives to Egyptian imperial control. Simultaneously, the enormous wealth that Egypt had extracted from Nubian territories through mining operations, tribute requirements, and trade monopolies had created resentments that were becoming more dangerous as tribal populations gained access to better weapons, more effective communication methods, and potential external allies who might support independence movements. Most importantly, the administrative systems that Egypt had established for governing Nubian territories had been designed for managing relatively simple societies with limited political organization and minimal external contacts. These systems were proving inadequate for dealing with increasingly sophisticated tribal confederations that possessed the organizational capabilities necessary for coordinated resistance to imperial authority. Tiye's strategic recommendation involved a fundamental reconceptualization of Egyptian policy toward Nubian territories that would address underlying causes of tribal unrest while maintaining Egyptian access to the economic resources that made Nubian control strategically essential. Rather than simply increasing military pressure to suppress tribal activities, she proposed a comprehensive approach that combined administrative reform, economic incentives, and diplomatic initiatives aimed at creating sustainable relationships that would benefit both Egyptian and tribal interests. The centerpiece of this new approach involved restructuring Egyptian administrative presence in Nubian territories to provide greater autonomy for local decision-making, while maintaining imperial oversight of essential functions like tribute collection, military security, and external relations. This would require replacing the current system of direct Egyptian administrative control with more flexible arrangements that acknowledged tribal political structures while ensuring that Egyptian strategic interests remained protected. Simultaneously, Egypt would need to develop new economic relationships with Nubian populations that provided them with greater benefits from continued association with the imperial system. Rather than simply extracting resources through tribute requirements and forced labor obligations, Egypt could offer expanded trade opportunities, technological assistance, and development projects that would improve tribal living standards, while generating economic returns that justified continued Egyptian investment in regional control. The diplomatic component of Tiye's strategy involved direct engagement with tribal leaders aimed at addressing legitimate grievances, while identifying and isolating groups that remained committed to violent resistance against Egyptian authority. This would require sophisticated understanding of tribal politics and careful attention to the complex relationships between different groups that shaped regional power dynamics. But implementing this revision comprehensive policy would require exactly the kind of complex coordination between military, administrative, diplomatic, and economic activities that had made Tiye's leadership so valuable during previous crises. The difference was that this coordination would need to be managed by Tutankhamun and his advisors, rather than through her direct operational control, though her strategic guidance and institutional knowledge would remain essential for ensuring successful implementation. The process began with carefully planned diplomatic initiatives designed to identify tribal leaders who might be willing to negotiate new arrangements that addressed their concerns while preserving Egyptian strategic interests. These weren't ultimatum presentations that demanded submission to imperial authority, but rather exploratory conversations aimed at understanding tribal perspectives and identifying areas where mutual accommodation might be possible. Simultaneously, Egyptian military preparations were adjusted to emphasize defensive capabilities and rapid response capacity, rather than the kind of massive mobilizations that might be interpreted as preparation for punitive campaigns against tribal populations. The goal was demonstrating Egyptian strength and resolve, while avoiding provocative actions that might unite different tribal groups against imperial authority. The economic component of the new policy involved comprehensive review of tribute requirements, trade regulations, and development priorities that had governed Egyptian administration of Nubian territories for decades. Rather than simply maintaining existing arrangements that had generated Egyptian wealth while providing minimal benefits to local populations, the review aimed to identify opportunities for expanding economic relationships in ways that would benefit both imperial and tribal interests. The results of this comprehensive policy revision exceeded even Tiye's optimistic expectations, as tribal leaders who had been participating in potentially hostile activities proved remarkably receptive to Egyptian diplomatic initiatives that acknowledged their legitimate concerns while offering tangible benefits from continued cooperation with imperial authority. Within 6 months of implementing these new diplomatic approaches, what had initially appeared to be a serious threat to Egyptian control over Nubian territories had transformed into an opportunity to strengthen imperial relationships while actually increasing Egyptian access to regional resources. Tribal confederations that had been coordinating potentially hostile activities against Egyptian authority became enthusiastic partners in expanded trade relationships that benefited both local populations and imperial treasuries. The success of this Nubian policy revision provided compelling evidence that the collaborative relationship between Tiye and Tutankhamun had achieved something remarkable in ancient political history. They had created a governmental partnership that combined the wisdom of accumulated experience with the energy of fresh leadership in ways that produced results superior to what either could have achieved independently. Foreign observers who had been monitoring Egypt's internal developments noted with surprise that the empire appeared stronger and more effectively governed than it had been even during the height of Amenhotep III's reign. But this very success created new challenges that neither Tiye nor Tutankhamun had anticipated when they began their collaborative approach to Egyptian governance. The effectiveness of their partnership had attracted attention from ambitious individuals throughout the Egyptian power structure, who recognized that associating themselves with such successful leadership could advance their own careers and political objectives. Most of these individuals were genuinely loyal Egyptian officials, military commanders, and administrators who sought to contribute to their empire's continued prosperity and greatness. Their interest in working closely with proven leadership represented exactly the kind of institutional loyalty that had made Egyptian civilization so durable and successful throughout its long history. But among these legitimate aspirants to greater responsibility were others whose motivations were more complex and potentially dangerous. The most concerning of these ambitious figures was a high-ranking military commander named Maya, who had distinguished himself during several recent campaigns and had begun cultivating relationships with various court officials, provincial governors, and religious authorities throughout the Egyptian administrative hierarchy. Maya possessed undeniable military competence and had demonstrated personal courage during dangerous combat situations that had enhanced his reputation among both soldiers and civilians. But intelligence reports that reached Tiye through her network of loyal informants suggested that Maya's ambitions might extend beyond simple career advancement within established Egyptian governmental structures. His private conversations with key military personnel reportedly included subtle criticisms of current policies and suggestions that Egypt's international challenges required more aggressive leadership than young pharaohs and elderly advisors could provide. More troubling were reports that Maya had been establishing independent communications with certain provincial governors and tribal leaders in regions where Egyptian authority had recently been challenged or remained potentially unstable. These contacts weren't necessarily treasonous, since military commanders naturally maintained relationships with the local authorities in areas where they might need to conduct operations. But the scope and frequency of Maya's communications suggested planning that exceeded normal operational requirements. Most alarming of all were indications that Maya had been receiving visits from individuals whose identities remained unknown, but who appeared to possess detailed knowledge of Egyptian governmental procedures, military capabilities, and strategic planning that suggested access to highly classified information. These mysterious contacts could represent legitimate consultations with Egyptian intelligence personnel or allied foreign representatives, but their secretive nature and irregular timing raised questions about Maya's ultimate loyalties and objectives. Tiye's analysis of the Maya situation reflected her decades of experience with the kind of palace intrigue that could threaten dynastic stability if not carefully managed. Her assessment was that Maya represented exactly the kind of ambitious military leader who had historically posed the greatest threats to pharaonic authority during periods of transition or apparent governmental weakness. The danger wasn't that Maya was necessarily planning immediate rebellion or coup attempts, though such possibilities couldn't be completely dismissed. Instead, the more serious threat was that his growing influence and independent power base could gradually undermine Tutankhamun's authority while creating alternative sources of loyalty within Egyptian military and administrative structures that could be activated during future crises. The challenge of managing this potential threat was complicated by the fact that Maya had never committed any clearly treasonous acts that would justify dramatic action against him. His military service remained exemplary. His public statements expressed complete loyalty to pharaonic authority, and his administrative responsibilities were ently and compete being fulfilled efficiently. Any direct confrontation with Maya based solely on suspicions about his ultimate intentions could appear arbitrary and might actually strengthen his position by creating sympathy for him among Egyptian officials who valued due process and legal procedures. Tiye's strategic approach to the Maya problem demonstrated once again why her political instincts had served Egypt so well throughout the most challenging periods of its imperial history. Rather than recommending immediate action against Maya that might create new problems while failing to address underlying issues, she proposed a comprehensive strategy that would neutralize potential threats while actually strengthening Tutankhamun's position within Egyptian governmental structures. The centerpiece of this strategy involved what amounted to a sophisticated loyalty verification process that would test the reliability of key personnel throughout Egyptian administration, while identifying individuals whose commitment to established authority might be questionable. This wasn't a purge or witch hunt that would terrorize innocent officials, but rather a carefully designed series of assignments, promotions, and responsibility transfers that would reveal true loyalties while rewarding genuine competence. Maya himself would be offered what appeared to be a significant promotion to a prestigious command position that would actually remove him from his current power base, while placing him under closer supervision by unquestionably loyal senior officers. The new assignment would be presented as recognition of his exceptional capabilities and would provide opportunities for him to demonstrate his loyalty through successful completion of challenging but well-defined military objectives. Simultaneously, the officials and commanders who had been cultivating relationships with Maya would be given similar opportunities to prove their reliability through assignments that would separate them from potential conspirators, while testing their commitment to established Egyptian governmental procedures and pharaonic authority. The implementation of this loyalty verification strategy required incredibly delicate management because any appearance that the royal family suspected widespread disloyalty could create exactly the kind of paranoid atmosphere that might drive genuinely loyal officials toward opposition. The process had to appear as routine administrative adjustments aimed at optimizing governmental efficiency rather than security measures designed to identify potential traitors. Tutankhamun's role in managing this complex operation demonstrated how effectively he had learned to integrate Tiye's strategic wisdom with his own developing political instincts. Rather than simply implementing her recommendations mechanically, he adapted her basic approach to reflect his personal leadership style, while adding innovative elements that addressed aspects of the situation that her analysis might not have fully considered. The young pharaoh's most significant contribution to the strategy involved recognizing that the Maya situation represented not just a security challenge, but also an opportunity to demonstrate his own leadership capabilities in ways that would strengthen his position with key constituencies throughout Egyptian society. By handling this potential threat with appropriate firmness, while maintaining respect for legal procedures and individual rights, he could establish his reputation as a leader who possessed both the strength necessary to protect Egyptian interests and the wisdom to avoid unnecessary conflicts that might damage national unity. The execution of the loyalty verification strategy began with Tutankhamun's announcement of a comprehensive reorganization of Egyptian military command structures designed to improve coordination between different types of forces and enhance overall operational effectiveness. Maya's promotion to a senior position responsible for coordinating defensive preparations along Egypt's eastern borders was presented as recognition of his proven competence and the crucial importance of maintaining security against potential threats from Mesopotamian kingdoms. The new assignment was indeed prestigious and carried significant responsibility, but it also required Maya to relocate to frontier regions where his activities could be closely monitored by established commanders whose loyalty to pharaonic authority was beyond question. More importantly, his new duties involved coordination with diplomatic and intelligence personnel, whose communications were routinely reviewed by royal supervisors, making any unauthorized contacts with foreign representatives virtually impossible to conceal. Similar reassignments were implemented throughout Egyptian administrative and military hierarchies as officials who had shown excessive interest in Maya's activities found themselves transferred to positions that provided excellent career advancement opportunities while separating them from potential conspirators and placing them under supervision by unquestionably reliable superiors. The results of this comprehensive personnel reorganization exceeded expectations, as individuals whose loyalty had been questionable demonstrated renewed commitment to established Egyptian governmental procedures when removed from potentially corrupting influences and provided with clear opportunities for legitimate advancement. Maya himself proved remarkably effective in his new command position, successfully implementing defensive improvements that enhanced Egyptian security while maintaining exemplary compliance with all reporting requirements and supervisory procedures. More importantly, the entire process had strengthened rather than weakened Egyptian governmental institutions by demonstrating that competent performance and genuine loyalty were consistently rewarded while questionable activities were addressed through legal procedures that protected individual rights while maintaining national security. Foreign observers who monitored these developments concluded that Egypt's governmental structures possessed exactly the kind of institutional resilience that made the empire such a formidable and reliable partner in international affairs. But managing the Maya situation represented only one aspect of the complex challenges that Tiye and Tutankhamun faced as they worked to consolidate Egypt's recovery from the disruptions of the Amarna period, while positioning the empire for continued prosperity and greatness. By 1318 from BCE, reports Egyptian diplomatic representatives throughout the ancient Near East indicated that major changes were occurring in regional power relationships that could significantly affect Egypt's strategic position, regardless of how successfully internal challenges were managed. The most significant of these international developments involved the emergence of a new and potentially formidable Hittite king named Mursili, who had consolidated control over Anatolian territories and was reportedly implementing military and administrative reforms that could dramatically increase Hittite capabilities for territorial expansion and diplomatic influence. Intelligence reports suggested that Mursili possessed both the personal charisma necessary for effective leadership and the strategic vision required to transform the Hittite kingdom from a regional power into a genuine rival for Egyptian dominance over the entire ancient Near East. Simultaneously, political changes in Mesopotamian kingdoms were creating opportunities for renewed coalition building that could pose serious challenges to Egyptian interests in the Levant and Syria. The failure of the previous Assyrian-Babylonian alliance had not eliminated the underlying strategic concerns that had motivated that cooperation, and there were indications that new leadership in both kingdoms was exploring alternative approaches to challenging Egyptian imperial authority. Most concerning of all were reports that these various international developments might be coordinated rather than coincidental. Egyptian intelligence sources suggested that diplomatic contacts were occurring between Hittite representatives and various Mesopotamian kingdoms, Palestinian city-states, and even certain Nubian tribal leaders that indicated planning for comprehensive challenges to Egyptian power that would exceed anything the empire had faced since the height of its imperial expansion under previous pharaohs. The strategic implications of these international developments were enormous because they suggested that Egypt might soon face simultaneous challenges across multiple frontiers that would test the empire's military capabilities, diplomatic resources, and internal unity in ways that had never been experienced during even the most difficult periods of Egyptian history. Managing such comprehensive threats would require coordination between military, diplomatic, and economic resources that exceeded anything that individual pharaohs had previously attempted. Tiye's analysis of this emerging international crisis reflected her deep understanding of the complex relationships between domestic stability and international security that had shaped Egyptian policy throughout her decades of leadership. Her assessment was that Egypt's ability to respond effectively to external challenges would depend fundamentally on maintaining internal unity and institutional effectiveness, while avoiding the kind of resource commitments that might weaken domestic support for imperial policies. The key insight was recognizing that comprehensive external threats actually provided opportunities for strengthening internal Egyptian unity by demonstrating the of national importance, solidarity in protecting the prosperity and security that Egyptian civilization had achieved through centuries of successful imperial expansion. Rather than viewing international challenges as problems that required purely military solutions, they could be presented as tests of Egyptian resolve and capability that would ultimately enhance the empire's prestige and influence if managed successfully. But realizing these opportunities would require strategic planning that integrated military preparedness, diplomatic initiative, economic policy, and domestic governance in ways that maximized Egyptian advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. This kind of comprehensive strategic coordination represented exactly the type of challenge that had made the collaborative relationship between Tiye and Tutankhamun so valuable throughout their years of partnership. The strategic framework that emerged from their consultations reflected both Tiye's accumulated wisdom about managing complex international challenges and Tutankhamun's fresh insights about Egyptian capabilities and opportunities under current conditions. Rather than attempting to address each potential threat individually through separate military, diplomatic, or economic responses, they developed an integrated approach that would use Egypt's comprehensive advantages to discourage enemy cooperation while strengthening Egyptian positions across all areas of potential conflict. The military component of this comprehensive strategy involved strategic positioning of Egyptian forces that would demonstrate readiness to defend imperial interests while avoiding provocative deployments that might encourage enemies to accelerate their planning or coordinate their activities more closely. Egyptian troops would be positioned to provide rapid response capabilities against threats from any direction while maintaining the flexibility necessary to concentrate forces wherever the most serious challenges might develop. The diplomatic dimension of the strategy emphasized proactive engagement with potential enemies, aimed at exploiting existing tensions and competing interests that made comprehensive anti-Egyptian coalitions inherently unstable. Rather than waiting for enemy alliances to solidify before responding, Egyptian diplomatic agents would work to prevent coalition formation by offering alternative arrangements that address legitimate concerns while preserving Egyptian strategic interests. The economic aspects of the integrated strategy involved using Egypt's enormous wealth and extensive commercial relationships to reward cooperation while imposing costs on hostile activities that exceeded any potential benefits from challenging Egyptian authority. This would require sophisticated coordination between trade policies, tribute arrangements, and development projects that would demonstrate Egyptian capacity to enhance prosperity for cooperative partners while making opposition economically unsustainable. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of the comprehensive strategy involved recognizing that Egypt's greatest advantage in any extended conflict would be the superior institutional effectiveness and social cohesion that had made Egyptian civilization so durable and successful throughout its long history. Rather than simply matching enemy military preparations or diplomatic initiatives, Egypt would demonstrate the kind of governmental competence and social unity that made the empire attractive to potential allies, while convincing enemies that challenging Egyptian authority would be more difficult and costly than they had anticipated. The implementation of this integrated strategy began with carefully coordinated diplomatic initiatives aimed at potential enemy kingdoms that emphasized Egypt's continued commitment to peaceful resolution of international disputes, while making clear that Egyptian defensive capabilities remained formidable and would be used decisively if necessary to protect imperial interests. These weren't ultimatums or threats, but rather professional communications between experienced diplomatic services that understood the importance of clear communication in preventing misunderstandings that might lead to unnecessary conflicts. Simultaneously, Egyptian military preparations were enhanced through training exercises, equipment upgrades, and strategic positioning that would be reported by foreign intelligence sources, but would demonstrate defensive rather than offensive intentions. The goal was convincing potential enemies that challenging Egyptian authority would require military commitments that exceeded anything they had previously contemplated, while reassuring neutral kingdoms that Egypt remained committed to stability and peaceful cooperation. The economic component of the strategy involved expanded trade initiatives, development projects, and financial assistance programs that would demonstrate Egyptian prosperity and generosity, while creating economic relationships that made cooperation with Egypt more attractive than opposition. These weren't simple bribery attempts, but rather sophisticated economic diplomacy that used Egypt's wealth to strengthen relationships with kingdoms that might otherwise be tempted to join anti-Egyptian coalitions. The domestic dimension of the comprehensive strategy required ensuring that Egyptian society remained unified and confident in pharaonic leadership, while the empire faced potential external challenges that could test national resolve unprecedented ways. This involved not only maintaining efficient governmental operations and economic prosperity, but also communicating effectively with Egyptian citizens about the international situation and their role in protecting the civilization them with security and prosperity for generations that had provided. Tutankhamun's personal leadership during this period of mounting international tensions demonstrated how effectively he had integrated Tiye's strategic wisdom with his own developing political instincts and leadership capabilities. His public appearances, policy announcements, and interactions with various Egyptian constituencies projected exactly the kind of confident competence that reassured citizens while impressing foreign observers with Egyptian institutional strength and leadership quality. The young pharaoh's most significant contribution to managing the international crisis involved recognizing that Egypt's response needed to reflect not just immediate security concerns, but also long-term strategic objectives that would shape the empire's position for generations to come. Rather than simply reacting to external threats, Egypt would use this challenge as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of comprehensive capabilities that would discourage future enemies while attracting reliable allies who valued association with such a formidable and well-governed empire. The effectiveness of this integrated strategic approach became apparent within months as intelligence reports indicated that potential enemy coalitions were experiencing exactly the kind of internal tensions and resource constraints that Egyptian diplomatic and economic initiatives had been designed to encourage. Kingdoms that had been exploring anti-Egyptian cooperation discovered that the costs of challenging Egyptian authority exceeded any potential benefits, while the advantages of maintaining positive relationships with Egypt continued increasing through expanded trade opportunities and development assistance. The Hittite kingdom, despite its new leadership and enhanced military capabilities, found itself unable to secure the kind of reliable allies that would be necessary for comprehensive challenges to Egyptian authority. Mesopotamian kingdoms that had considered renewed coalition building discovered that Egyptian diplomatic agents were offering alternative arrangements that addressed their legitimate concerns while avoiding the enormous risks associated with military confrontation with such a well-prepared and strategically positioned enemy. Most importantly, potential allies throughout the ancient Near East were taking careful note of how skillfully Egypt was managing this complex international challenge. Rather than viewing Egyptian diplomatic initiatives as evidence of weakness or uncertainty, they recognized sophisticated strategic thinking that made Egyptian friendship even more valuable, while Egyptian enmity became correspondingly more dangerous to contemplate. By early 1317 BCE, what had initially appeared to be Egypt's most serious international crisis since the empire's establishment had been transformed into a demonstration of Egyptian strategic competence that actually enhanced the empire's prestige and influence throughout the ancient Near East. Potential enemies had concluded that challenging Egyptian authority would be prohibitively difficult and costly, while neutral kingdoms had renewed their interest in expanding cooperative relationships with such a formidable and reliable partner. But perhaps the most significant outcome of this international crisis was its demonstration that the collaborative relationship between Tiye and Tutankhamun had achieved something unprecedented in ancient political history. They had created a governmental partnership that successfully integrated the wisdom of experience with the energy of youth in ways that produced strategic capabilities superior to what traditional individual leadership could achieve. Foreign observers who had been monitoring Egyptian governmental developments reported to their home courts that the empire appeared to possess institutional depth and leadership quality that exceeded anything seen during previous reigns. Military analysts noted that Egyptian strategic planning demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex international relationships that suggested exceptional advisory capabilities supporting pharaonic decision-making. Diplomatic representatives found Egyptian negotiating positions to be both reasonable and remarkably well-informed about regional political dynamics and competing national interests. Yet even as these external successes validated the effectiveness of their collaborative approach, both Tiye and Tutankhamun understood that the very comprehensiveness of Egypt's strategic triumph had created new challenges that would require continued adaptation of their governmental partnership. The empire's enhanced international prestige and demonstrated capabilities had attracted attention from ambitious individuals and kingdoms throughout the ancient Near East, who might view association with Egyptian success as opportunities for advancing their own interests and objectives. Most of this attention represented exactly the kind of positive international response that successful strategic planning was designed to achieve. Kingdoms that had previously maintained cautious neutrality were requesting expanded diplomatic relationships and trade agreements that would benefit both Egyptian and foreign interests. Military commanders from allied territories were seeking training opportunities and equipment assistance that would enhance their defensive capabilities while strengthening their cooperation with Egyptian strategic planning. Religious authorities from throughout the region were expressing interest in cultural exchanges and ceremonial cooperation that would reinforce the social foundations of international stability. But among these legitimate expressions of interest in enhanced cooperation with Egypt were others whose motivations were more complex and potentially problematic. Intelligence reports indicated that certain foreign representatives were attempting to establish independent relationships with individual Egyptian officials, military commanders, and provincial governors that bypassed normal diplomatic channels and supervisory procedures. These contacts weren't necessarily hostile, but their secretive nature and irregular patterns suggested planning that might not align with established Egyptian policy objectives. More concerning were indications that some foreign kingdoms were using their enhanced diplomatic access to Egyptian governmental personnel as opportunities for gathering detailed intelligence about Egyptian military capabilities, administrative procedures, and strategic planning that exceeded what legitimate cooperative relationships would require. This information gathering wasn't necessarily preparation for hostile activities, but it represented the kind of comprehensive intelligence collection that could be valuable for various purposes that might not serve Egyptian interests. Most troubling of all were reports that certain ambitious individuals within Egyptian society were using the empire's enhanced international prestige as justification for proposing policy changes and governmental reforms that could fundamentally alter the balance of authority within Egyptian political structures. These proposals weren't necessarily inappropriate, since successful empires naturally evolved their governmental procedures to address changing circumstances and opportunities. But the timing and scope of some suggested planning that might reflect personal ambitions rather than genuine concern for Egyptian prosperity and security. Tiye's analysis of these emerging challenges reflected her decades of experience with the complex relationships between external success and internal stability that had shaped Egyptian political development throughout the empire's history. Her assessment was that Egypt's strategic triumph had created exactly the kind of enhanced opportunities and increased pressures that required careful management to ensure that external achievements translated into lasting internal benefits rather than new sources of division and conflict. The fundamental challenge was maintaining the institutional unity and governmental effectiveness that had made Egypt's international success possible while adapting to the enhanced responsibilities and expanded opportunities that such success inevitably created. This required balancing the legitimate aspirations of Egyptian officials and citizens who wanted to benefit from their empire's achievements with the security requirements and strategic continuity that would be necessary to preserve and build upon those achievements. More importantly, it required ensuring that the collaborative relationship between Tiye and Tutankhamun continued evolving in ways that strengthened rather than complicated Egyptian governmental effectiveness, as both of them adapted to the changing demands of leadership in an empire whose international position had been fundamentally enhanced through their successful partnership. The strategic approach that emerged from their consultations about managing these post-success challenges reflected the same sophisticated integration of practical wisdom and innovative thinking that had characterized their collaboration throughout the most difficult periods of Egyptian recovery and international crisis management. Rather than simply attempting to preserve existing arrangements that had proven successful, they developed adaptive strategies that would use Egypt's enhanced position to address emerging opportunities while maintaining the institutional stability and leadership continuity that remained essential for long-term prosperity and security. The process began with a comprehensive review of existing governmental procedures and administrative relationships that had evolved during Egypt's recovery from the Amarna crisis and successful management of recent international challenges. Rather than implementing dramatic changes that might disrupt established patterns of cooperation and authority, they identified specific areas where gradual adjustments could enhance Egyptian capabilities while preserving the institutional stability that had made their collaborative leadership so effective. The most significant of these adjustments involved creating what amounted to expanded advisory structures that would provide Tutankhamun with access to broader ranges of expertise and perspective, while maintaining clear lines of authority and decision-making responsibility. These weren't bureaucratic expansions that would complicate governmental operations, but rather strategic enhancements that would ensure Egyptian policy development benefited from the most comprehensive analysis and diverse viewpoints available within the empire's administrative and intellectual resources. Tiye's role in these expanded advisory arrangements reflected her continued evolution from active operational leadership toward what we might recognize as senior strategic consultation. Her decades of accumulated experience remained invaluable for analyzing complex situations and identifying potential consequences that might not be apparent to younger advisors, but her involvement would be structured to support and enhance Tutankhamun's authority, rather than competing with or complicating his decision-making processes. The implementation enhancements began with carefully of these governmental and planned consultations between Tutankhamun and senior administrators, military commanders, and provincial governors, who possessed detailed knowledge of specific aspects of Egyptian operations that could benefit from enhanced coordination and strategic integration. These weren't formal reorganization meetings that might create anxiety about job security or authority relationships, but rather professional discussions aimed at identifying opportunities for improving Egyptian governmental effectiveness. One particularly valuable series of these consultations involved meetings with Egyptian diplomatic personnel, who had managed relationships with foreign kingdoms during the recent international crisis. Their insights about changing regional political dynamics, emerging opportunities for beneficial cooperation, and potential future challenges provided essential information for strategic planning that would guide Egyptian international relations for years to come. The diplomatic officers reported that foreign rulers throughout the ancient Near East were expressing unprecedented interest in establishing closer relationships with Egypt, following the empire's sophisticated management of potential military threats. Kingdoms that had previously maintained minimal contact with Egyptian representatives were requesting expanded trade agreements, military cooperation arrangements, and cultural exchange programs that could significantly enhance Egyptian influence while providing valuable economic and strategic benefits. But these diplomatic opportunities also presented challenges that required careful management to ensure that Egyptian commitments remained sustainable and that expanding international relationships didn't create vulnerabilities that future enemies might exploit. The volume of requests for Egyptian cooperation and assistance was beginning to exceed the empire's administrative capacity for managing complex international arrangements, while the variety of proposed agreements required policy decisions about priorities and strategic objectives that would shape Egyptian international relations for generations. Tutankhamun's response to these diplomatic challenges demonstrated how effectively he had learned to integrate comprehensive analysis with decisive leadership in ways that reflected both strategic wisdom and practical competence. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting foreign proposals based on immediate considerations, he initiated a systematic review of Egyptian international objectives that would provide clear guidelines for evaluating future opportunities, while ensuring that all commitments remained consistent with long-term strategic planning. The review process involved extensive consultations with Tiye about historical precedents and strategic principles that had guided successful Egyptian international relations during previous reigns. Her knowledge of past diplomatic successes and failures provided essential context for understanding how current opportunities related to broader patterns of regional political development and Egyptian strategic interests. Simultaneously, Tutankhamun worked with his military advisors to assess the defensive and strategic implications of various proposed international agreements. Enhanced cooperation with certain kingdoms could provide valuable intelligence about potential threats while creating mutual defense obligations that would strengthen Egyptian security. But some proposals involved commitments that could require Egyptian military resources that might be needed for defending core imperial territories if more serious challenges developed. The economic aspects of expanding international relationships received equally careful attention as Egyptian administrators calculated the costs and benefits of various proposed trade agreements, development assistance programs, and tribute arrangements. Egypt's enormous wealth provided opportunities for using economic relationships to advance strategic objectives. But the empire's resources weren't unlimited, and careful prioritization would be essential for ensuring that international commitments enhanced rather than strained Egyptian domestic prosperity. The results of this comprehensive policy review exceeded expectations as the systematic analysis revealed opportunities for expanding Egyptian international influence in ways that actually reduced rather than increased the empire's strategic vulnerabilities while providing substantial economic and political benefits. Rather than simply responding to foreign requests on an individual basis, Egypt could implement coordinated international initiatives that would advance multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. The centerpiece of this enhanced international strategy involved the creation of what amounted to a comprehensive regional partnership system that would provide smaller kingdoms with security guarantees, economic assistance, and technological cooperation in exchange for reliable political support and strategic cooperation that would strengthen Egyptian influence throughout the ancient Near East. This wasn't traditional imperial expansion that required military conquest and direct administrative control over foreign territories. Instead, It represented a sophisticated form of international leadership that used Egypt's superior resources and governmental capabilities to create voluntary associations that benefited all participants while ensuring that Egyptian strategic interests remained protected and advanced. The implementation of this partnership system required incredibly sophisticated diplomatic coordination, as Egyptian representatives worked simultaneously with dozens of different kingdoms to negotiate agreements that addressed their specific needs and circumstances while maintaining consistency with broader Egyptian strategic objectives. Each partnership arrangement needed to be individually tailored to local conditions and political dynamics, but all of them had to contribute to the overall goal of strengthening Egyptian regional influence. Tiye's contribution to managing this complex diplomatic initiative demonstrated once again why her accumulated experience remained so valuable despite her reduced involvement in day-to-day governmental operations. Her decades of international relationship building had created personal connections and institutional knowledge that proved essential for understanding the subtle political dynamics and historical relationships that shaped each kingdom's approach to potential cooperation with Egyptian authority. More importantly, her strategic insights helped identify ways that individual partnership agreements could be structured to reinforce each other in creating a comprehensive network of Egyptian influence that would be more durable and effective than simple bilateral relationships. Rather than creating separate arrangements with each foreign kingdom, Egypt was constructing an integrated regional system that would provide mutual benefits while making challenges to Egyptian authority increasingly difficult and costly for potential enemies to contemplate. The success of this regional partnership initiative became apparent within months as kingdoms throughout the ancient Near East competed for inclusion in arrangements that provided access to Egyptian resources, protection, and prestige, while requiring relatively modest commitments in return. Foreign rulers who had initially approached Egypt seeking specific forms of assistance discovered that partnership arrangements offered comprehensive benefits that exceeded their original expectations. More significantly, the creation of this partnership network was producing strategic advantages that enhanced Egyptian security, while actually reducing the military and administrative costs traditionally associated with maintaining imperial influence over extensive territories. Instead of requiring permanent military garrisons and direct administrative oversight, Egypt could maintain regional dominance through cooperative relationships that were largely self-sustaining and provided positive incentives for continued loyalty. The international reaction to Egypt's partnership system impressed foreign observers throughout the ancient Near East, who recognized the sophisticated strategic thinking that had produced such comprehensive and mutually beneficial arrangements. Rather than viewing Egyptian initiatives as evidence of imperial expansion that might threaten regional stability, neutral kingdoms interpreted the partnership network as innovative diplomacy that actually enhanced prospects for peace and prosperity throughout the region. But managing this expanding network of international relationships required ongoing attention and coordination that tested the evolved collaborative partnership between Tiye and Tutankhamun in new ways. The volume and complexity of diplomatic correspondence, trade negotiations, and strategic planning sessions had increased dramatically as Egypt's regional influence expanded, while the consequences of policy decisions had become correspondingly more significant for both Egyptian and foreign interests. The challenge was particularly acute because successful international leadership required maintaining consistent strategic direction while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances that could affect multiple partnership relationships simultaneously. Economic disruptions, political changes, or military tensions in any part of the regional network could have cascading effects that required coordinated responses involving diplomatic, military, and economic measures that exceeded traditional governmental capabilities. Tutankhamun's approach to managing these enhanced leadership responsibilities demonstrated remarkable maturation in his strategic thinking and administrative capabilities. Rather than attempting to micromanage every aspect of Egypt's expanding international operations, he focused on establishing clear strategic principles and coordination mechanisms that would allow experienced administrators and diplomatic personnel to handle routine matters while ensuring that significant decisions received appropriate royal attention and approval. The key was innovation, creating what amounted to specialized advisory groups' expertise that possess in different aspects of Egyptian international operations and could provide comprehensive analysis of complex situations that involved multiple considerations and competing priorities. These weren't permanent bureaucratic expansions that might complicate decision-making processes, but rather flexible coordination mechanisms that could be adapted to address whatever challenges or opportunities might develop. Tiye's role in these enhanced advisory arrangements reflected her continued evolution towards senior strategic consultation that complemented rather than competed with Tutankhamun's increasingly confident leadership. Her participation in policy discussions provided historical perspective and strategic wisdom that enhanced the quality of analysis and decision-making without creating confusion about ultimate authority and responsibility for Egyptian governmental operations. The effectiveness of these adaptive leadership arrangements was tested dramatically in late 1316 BCE, when a succession crisis in the kingdom of Ugarit created both opportunities and risks that could significantly affect Egyptian strategic interests throughout the eastern Mediterranean region. Ugarit occupied a crucial position, controlling important trade routes that connected Egyptian territories with Anatolian and Mesopotamian markets, while its military capabilities could provide valuable support for Egyptian operations or serious complications if the kingdom fell under hostile influence. The succession dispute involved 3 different claimants to the Ugaritic throne, each representing different political factions with varying degrees of sympathy toward Egyptian interests and objectives. Traditional Egyptian policy might have involved immediate military intervention to support preferred candidates, but such direct involvement could trigger broader conflicts that might draw other regional powers into opposition against Egyptian influence. Alternatively, Egypt could maintain strict neutrality in Ugaritic internal affairs, but such non-involvement might allow hostile forces to gain control over strategically important territories that could be used to threaten Egyptian trade routes and regional partnerships. The situation required sophisticated analysis and carefully coordinated responses that balanced immediate tactical considerations with long-term strategic objectives. Tutankhamun's initial approach to the Ugaritic crisis demonstrated how effectively he had learned to integrate comprehensive strategic analysis with decisive leadership in ways that reflected both wisdom and practical competence. Rather than rushing toward either military intervention or passive non-involvement, he initiated systematic evaluation of Egyptian interests and available options that would guide coordinated policy development. The analysis process involved extensive consultations with diplomatic personnel who possessed detailed knowledge of Ugaritic political dynamics and the various succession candidates' likely policies toward Egyptian interests. Military advisors provided assessments of strategic implications and potential intervention requirements, while economic specialists calculated the costs and benefits of different possible outcomes for Egyptian trade relationships and regional economic interests. Tiye's contribution to this comprehensive analysis proved invaluable, as her decades of experience with similar succession crises provided essential insights about the complex relationships between internal political dynamics and international strategic considerations. Her historical perspective helped identify patterns and precedents that suggested which approaches were most likely to produce favorable outcomes while avoiding unintended consequences that could damage Egyptian interests. More importantly, her strategic wisdom helped recognize that the Ugaritic succession crisis represented an opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of Egypt's new regional partnership system in ways that could strengthen Egyptian influence while providing benefits for all participants in the network. Rather than viewing the crisis as an isolated problem requiring separate solution, it could become a test case for coordinated regional diplomacy that would establish precedents for future cooperation. The strategy that emerged from these comprehensive consultations reflected sophisticated understanding of both immediate tactical requirements and long-term strategic objectives. Rather than supporting any single succession candidate directly, Egypt would work with its regional partners to facilitate negotiations among the competing claimants that could produce stable governance arrangements satisfactory to all major Ugaritic political factions, while ensuring that the kingdom's foreign policy remained compatible with Egyptian regional leadership. And so ends the remarkable story of Tiye, the queen mother who wielded more power than pharaohs while never officially holding the throne. From her provincial origins to becoming the most influential woman in Egyptian history, she demonstrated that true leadership flows not from titles, but from wisdom, strategic thinking, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Through her shadow rule during Akhenaten's chaotic reign and her masterful mentorship of Tutankhamun, Tiye proved that the most effective power often operates behind the scenes, shaping destinies through careful planning rather than dramatic gestures. Her legacy reminds us that history's greatest leaders aren't always the ones whose names are carved in stone, but those who ensure civilizations survive and thrive for future generations.